Lord of Industrialization. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction. So please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story in all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter. And if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 151 Counterattack. Count Firth was irritated. Although he had broken through the Wessenland lines, this charge was the most frustrating of his life. Thinking back to previous battles with the Duchy of Franconia, whether it was the clashes between knights or the effortless cutting through of infantry formations, each one was filled with passion and enthusiasm. But today, the Wesson troops were like rats. They had dug numerous trenches in the ground. Though narrow, they were impassable once a man crouched down in them. He glanced at the distant command tower and decided to charge the heavy cavalry through these trenches. He calculated that the 1,000 infantrymen who had bypassed a hillside would also be ready to cross it. Then, together with the light cavalry behind him, they would sweep through the Wesson positions. As he charged, Count Firth suddenly realized he was slowing down. There were more trenches behind him, and his horses didn't have enough distance to accelerate after jumping one. This worried him. If the heavy cavalry lost their speed, they would be ready to be slaughtered, not to mention the light cavalry that was following him. The Count's worries soon ceased, for he realized he had fallen into a trap. The trenches had been dug into adjacent equilateral triangles, with him in the middle. From all three corners, he was under a barrage of bullets. Amidst the screams around him, Count Firth heard a series of explosions from the other side of the hill. Then he saw something the size of a fist land on a horse's head, and then nothing happened. Elsewhere, the soldiers in the trenches, having spared the heavy cavalry, began firing at the light cavalry following behind, separating the two groups. However, the tin cans found it difficult to turn back, and the battlefield was extremely noisy, and their helmets impaired their hearing. To his death, Count Firth was unaware that his heavy cavalry had been isolated. Flanking positions on the adjacent hills also opened fire, instantly knocking down a large number of the light cavalry following behind. The light cavalry, suffering heavy casualties, retreated, regrouped, and launched an attack towards the center of the Wesson position. By then, the soldiers in the trenches had just finished dealing with the fire elemental giants, reloaded their ammunition, and began firing at the light cavalry. The allied infantry began to advance, and Ardisha also began to cast a new summoning spell. The newly summoned creature made little Franz frown, and Frederick's forehead was full of black lines. If he was not mistaken, this creature should be a triceratops, 9 meters long, 3 meters tall, and estimated to weigh over 10 tons. The huge bony shield on its head and the 1.5-meter-long bony horn shocked the entire Wesson army. It was not for any other reason, but because little Franz and his group of young officers always showed off by riding unicorns. If a unicorn with one horn was so powerful, wouldn't this giant with 3 horns be even more powerful? The triceratops approached the position slowly, their heads and bony shields suddenly emitting a thick ochre light, and bullets hit them without any reaction. Little Franz immediately ordered to avoid the frontal bony shields, firing from the side with P-guns and firing from behind with cherry cannons. The beast trainers on the other side are no good. After giving the order, little Franz said to Frederick, if these triceratops were lined up in a row and the infantry followed behind, they might be able to break through the first line of defense. Now these triceratops were scattered, their flanks exposed, and they were quickly beaten into honeycomb coals. Frederick was still thinking about raising a group of them, as they would be good for heavy cavalry, but when he saw their size and thought about their appetite, he finally gave up. At this time, a south wind blew in the sky, and the Allied infantry advanced to a distance of 200 meters from the position. Count Ansbach's face was terribly dark, and he ordered, use poison gas bombs. The archers prepared the long arrows tied with poison gas bombs, and after lighting the fuse, they shot them all. A wall of smoke suddenly appeared in front of the position, drifting northward towards the Wesson army. At this point, Franz the Younger said, it's time to launch a counterattack. Frederick simply replied, you'll handle the details. The Allied forces had already halted their advance. Archers were unleashing poison gas shells at full force, even into the nearby forests. The thick white smoke made it seem as if charging headfirst would be like running into sheep. Anticipating a counterattack, Count Ansbach deployed all his heavy infantry at the front, followed by pikemen and archers at the rear. Rudolf anxiously asked Count Ansbach, "Will Wesson lose now?" Count Ansbach breathed a sigh of relief. After the losses of Count Roth, Count Firth, and almost all of his magicians and cavalry, he had finally waited for this moment. "We're doomed," he said calmly. "No matter what the weapon, as long as it's manned, it's useless without the man. We now have more than twice their number. The advantage is on our side." As he finished speaking, a resounding trumpet blast echoed from behind the thick smoke. The rumbling of hooves followed, and 3 black-horned, purple-bodied unicorns emerged from the white smoke, followed by a large, neatly arrayed group of cavalry. All the cavalry, both riders and mounts, wore gas masks and dark gray uniforms. Their helmets featured an armor plate emblazoned with a golden double-headed eagle. The Allied heavy infantry in the front row held their halberds horizontally, ready to meet the enemy. These mountain mercenaries' signature halberds consisted of a long spear with a heavy battle axe mounted on the head. The axe had a hook at the back. This weapon could thrust directly, chopping through armored foes with the axe. The hook at the back could be used to dislodge cavalrymen, and the spike at the end could be driven into the ground, dampening the impact of a collision. Combined with their half-body plate armor and mail, even heavy cavalry would have to consider charging once they formed a formation. However, the Wesson cavalry, equipped with 3.5-meter-long high-explosive spears, instantly reduced these heavy infantrymen to smithereens. The 3 captains of the cavalry company, Jurgen, Lothar, and Andrei, led the first row of cavalrymen, using high-explosive spears to carve a gap in the Allied heavy infantry line on the eastern flank. Then, like the soldiers in the 2 rows behind them, they drew their sabers and revolvers, first firing their ammunition at the enemy in front, then wielding their swords to mow down the infantry. In a moment, the cavalry had pierced the infantry phalanx in front of them and began sweeping down the archers behind them. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a golden double-headed eagle banner emerged from the white smoke, followed by rows of dark gray figures. Not only the mountain mercenaries and the Allied city defenders, but even Count Ansbach, Rudolf, and the others had never seen a gas mask before. They subconsciously assumed that the people before them were demons from hell, otherwise they would have been unaffected by the poisonous smoke. These dark gray devils drew their weapons. Cherry Company soldiers launched grenades at the heavy infantry. The shockwave and steel pellets from the detonation of the angina drug were no match for the half-plate armor and mail, and within a few breaths, the heavy infantry failed. Next came the soldiers with mushroom guns. They opened fire from 50 meters away from the Allied forces, and the spray of steel pellets disrupted the spearmen's formation. Then, the soldiers with P-guns launched a bayonet charge against the vastly outnumbered enemy. Cherry Company and the mushroom gun soldiers removed their engineering shovels and joined the hand-to-hand combat. Chapter 152 The War Ends. Count Ansbach watched the battle unfold in astonishment. The enemy's momentum was unstoppable, and his own troops were filled with fear. Despite their superior numbers, they were on the receiving end, and collapse was inevitable. Rudolf, already panicking, hurriedly called on Count Ansbach to bring up the peasants from the rear. Count Ansbach had no choice but to bring in the peasants who had been guarding the rear, hoping to wear down the Wesson army. However, this was counterproductive. The peasants, who had only a few days before been farmers, trembled at the sight of the Wesson troops, and some even deserted. Just then, little Franz, mounted on a crimson unicorn, charged into the enemy ranks, followed by several other knights of the second generation, including regimental and battalion commanders, also mounted unicorns. Frederick ordered them to collect their losses on the battlefield. Count Ansbach, noticing they seemed to be heading for him, snorted coldly, drew his weapon, and rode forward, ready to meet the young men's challenge. At that moment, Rudolf suddenly rode his unicorn toward the western hillside, followed by several of his followers. Count Eichstadt, who had been invisible for a while, saw this and followed suit. Now without territory, she had no choice but to cling to the crown prince if she wanted to live happily. Count Ansbach glanced at him and sighed, not surprised at all. His Highness had done the same thing 3 years earlier. He had fled early, and the barely holdable front collapsed instantly, with the entire army pursued for more than 10 kilometers by the Gallic army. As Rudolf ascended the hill on his unicorn, Count Eichstadt followed. The two raced up the mountain in silence. However, this was near a flank position, and the bushes were heavily mined. As they neared the summit, someone tripped a tripwire, detonating a series of enemy-facing this way mines. Rudolph fell heavily to the ground, his beautiful unicorn pinning his left leg. He had no choice but to remove the leg armor himself and carefully pull his leg free. Fortunately, the material of the leg armor was excellent, and the unicorn's weight didn't injure his leg. Rudolph staggered to his feet, turned his head and looked around. He saw that his unicorn was dying, its right side covered in bleeding holes. The other horses also lay bleeding on the ground. He also saw Count Eichstadt's eyes fixed on him, but the back of his head was missing. The fear of death instantly surged through him. Rudolph struggled to pull the leg armor from under the unicorn's body, intending to escape after fully armoring himself, not considering how far he could run in his tin can. "Do you need help?" Frederick appeared on the top of the mountain, followed by Dawn. Startled, Rudolph hurriedly picked up his sword from the ground, took 2 deep breaths, and rushed over. But one leg was clad in leg armor, the other barefoot. He barely took 2 steps before he collapsed, his weapon tumbling far away. Frederick frowned, approached, and before the crown prince could get up, he stamped on his back and tapped his helmet with his sword. Don't kill me," Rudolph cried, his voice piercing with tears. Frederick said emotionlessly, "What if I kill you?" Ahem. Beecher, the head of the royal mages, suddenly appeared from nowhere. "Please, Baron Wesson, show mercy." Rudolph heard his voice and shouted excitedly, "Sir Beecher, hurry. I command you to capture him. If you do, I win." The crown prince commanded the royal mages. Asking a magician to capture a child was naturally easier than capturing a newly hatched chick. Defeat on the battlefield was irrelevant. With the mages, victory was within reach. Beecher said to Frederick, "Please forgive me, Baron Wesson. This is my duty. If you cooperate, I will only tie you up. It won't hurt." Frederick sneered and stomped hard on Rudolph's helmet, causing the crown prince to cry out in fear. Beecher didn't move, only looking behind Frederick. Richardel smiled and said to Frederick, "You can stomp on him more." Beecher narrowed his eyes slightly and said to the sword saint, "Don't go too far. It's still unclear who would lose in a fight between us." With that, he transformed into full body armor resembling flaming crystal in less than half an eye blink. The opponent was a melee fighter, so if they were going to engage in a fight, they would naturally put on a layer of armor first. Furthermore, Richardel was known among their circle of magic gods for his ability to sneak attacks, so he had to be on guard. However, Richardel simply smiled, showing no sign of concern, and encouraged Frederick with his eyes to stomp on him more quickly. Frederick raised his foot and stomped hard on the back of Rudolph's head. In that moment, something happened. As he lifted his foot, Beecher moved. But just as Frederick's foot reached its highest point, Beecher's magic armor instantly vanished without a trace. Rudolph wailed again, and Psyche scratched Frederick's head. Beecher was stunned. His magic armor had vanished for no reason. Even more baffling was why he couldn't mobilize even a fraction of the fire elemental power when there was so much surrounding it. Richardel was performing exaggerated warm-up exercises, gloatingly saying to Beecher, "Let's fight now." "You go first." Beecher stared intently at Psyche. It was clear that the abnormalities in the magic elemental power were related to her. Psyche said calmly, "I proposed this theory 200 years ago, but the world only laughed at it. No one studied it, and within 10 years, no one mentioned it anymore. If someone had studied it back then, you might have a fighting chance now." Beecher fell silent, studying the surrounding flowers and plants. Those who become mage sword masters are those who have lived long lives and know how to choose when to save their lives. What happened next, as recorded in the official history of the Wesson family, the legend of the double-headed eagle, was that Baron Wesson gave a moving speech to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince was deeply moved and ultimately decided to vindicate Count Henry von Wesson. He apologized at Count Wesson's tomb on his father's behalf and conferred the title of Duke of Wesson on Frederick von Wesson, granting him the lands of Ries, Eichstatt, Ansbach, Fürth, and Roth, and the protectorate of the Free City of Nuremberg. From then on, the Wesson family and the royal family put aside their past grievances. In risque books, such as the Romance of Frederick the Great, a spark ignited between Frederick and Rudolph after he removed his helmet. While Frederick's grave was covered in flowers, a vast collection of rare books and historical materials was discovered in a secret room of the Edelweiss Library, including the story of the two-headed eagle, Psyche's commentary. Numerous historians were puzzled by Psyche's note in the margin of her historical account. On his descent from the mountain, Rudolph resembled the iron-eating beast, No one understood the iron-eating beast to be some kind of magical beast or a metaphor. The mystery was only solved when a great Eastern power later donated a giant panda to the Wessenland Zoo. No one knew what would happen next, and Frederick didn't care about the subsequent narrative. His bottom line was to avoid being portrayed as effeminate. Meanwhile, Count Ansbach was pierced through the armor and throat by the saber of Franz the Younger, and the Allied forces collapsed and fled. Franz the Elder launched an early morning attack from Hausen, positioning himself in the Allied rear. After killing the fastest deserters, he began collecting prisoners. Meanwhile, the Black Cats, taking advantage of the Ansbach family castle's vacant position, launched a surprise attack, capturing Lady Ansbach and her son and daughter. The Allied siege of Wessenland ended with approximately 40,000 Allied troops killed or captured, while the Wesson army suffered 25 killed and over 200 wounded. The battle, which lasted 6 days from April 18, 1026, to April 23, earned the name the 6 Days' War. Chapter 153 Status Upgraded. The Wessenseiten reported on May 8 in Wessenberg that His Royal Highness, Crown Prince Rudolf Otto of the Confederation of the Rhine, signed the Treaty of Wesson with Duke Friedrich von Wesson in Wessenberg on the morning of the 8th. The signing was witnessed by Grand Duke Dalberg von Mainz, Grand Duke Ludwig Wittelsbach of Bavaria, Mayor Max Merkel of the Free City of Nuremberg, and Archbishop Victor, the plenipotentiary envoy of the Church of Light. The main contents of the Treaty of Wesson are as follows. 1. The Otto family of the Confederation of the Rhine and the House of Wesson are one family. Duke Friedrich von Wesson recognizes and firmly upholds the authority of his brother, King William Otto, and the House of Wesson pledges allegiance to the Otto family too. King William Otto confers upon Frederick von Wesson the title of Duke of Wesson, with a fiefdom of the canton of Wesson encompassing the former lands of Wesson, Ries, Eichstätt, Ansbach, Fürth, Roth, and the Free City of Nuremberg. Third, the false charges previously brought against Count St. Henry von Wesson were immediately dropped. The false accusers, Counts Ries, Eichstätt, Ansbach, Fürth, and Roth, were stripped of all their titles, and their family property was fully compensated to the Wesson family. Crown Prince Rudolf Otto presided over a ceremony of consolation at the Wessenberg Cathedral. The Wesson Daily reported on May 8 that Duke Frederick von Wesson held a grand investiture and decoration ceremony at Wessenberg Square at noon on the 8th. During the ceremony, Duke Wesson knighted over 20 individuals for their outstanding performance during the war and awarded them medals of merit. A grand military parade followed the ceremony. "Are you unhappy?" Maria asked Frederick curiously. The direct promotion of Baron Wesson to Duke of Wesson was a major event that would change the strategic landscape of the region. Naturally, the Grand Duke of Mainz came to witness it in person. In addition to his heir and a group of officials, he also brought Maria with him. Frederick folded the newspaper and placed it on the dining table. He said somewhat helplessly, "It's nothing. It's just that the reporters and editors at the newspaper weren't doing a good enough job." Many of the reporters were women Richardner had brought back from Constantinople. They were well educated, and some had learned Rhenish before going on to work at the Wesson Daily. However, these people, who had lived in seclusion for years, had only casually chatted about politics and salons. When writing about current affairs, they lacked a clear understanding of the political and ideological aspects of the news. They even omitted a single mention of the funerals of the fallen soldiers. Frederick had no choice. A new thing couldn't be perfected overnight. He could only write more commentary. Lunch arrived, and while eating, he asked Maria, "Where else do you want to go?" Maria replied, "I'm going to play with Dawn first." "We'll play together when you're done." Frederick could only nod. There was much to do after the war, starting with in-depth negotiations with Rudolf. Rudolf, completely unskilled in political negotiation, could only send Baron Christian, who had originally delivered a declaration of war, back to Cologne to report to King William. Baron Christian had been in Ansbach during the war and had survived. Upon learning of the annihilation of the Allied forces and the capture of the Crown Prince, King William collapsed and remained bedridden for 3 days. Upon waking, the left corner of his mouth was slightly crooked. Frederick offered the royal family a superficial favor in exchange for land and the assets of 5 other families. In any era, prestige was secondary, profit was paramount. A private agreement was reached between the two sides. With the exception of Madame Roth and Count Ries's imbecile son, Rudolf would take all members of the Allied families back to Cologne, allowing them to take some valuables. In that era, Nobles valued leaving a margin of truth for future encounters, and his approach was in keeping with tradition. Next came the task of distributing the territories. This involved reforming the government structure of Wesson, but detailed regulations were not yet available, and a meeting was required for discussion. The entire Wesson state government, from top to bottom, was now as busy as a war effort. From the tax department to the fire department, they all conducted research in new territories at the behest of their master, then held small meetings to compile statistics and midterm meetings to analyze them in preparation for the grand meeting. Finally, Frederick's biggest headache was his relationship with his two neighbors. Previously, as a mere baron, he could naturally curry favor with the two Grand Dukes, but now as a duke, administratively, all he lacked was the ability to establish his own court. They were now on equal terms. Counts had their own rules of survival, and dukes had their own. For both counts and barons, the primary goal was to preserve their lineage. At the duke's level, beyond his own family, he had to consider the concerns of his vassal families, ensuring they felt a sense of hope for the future, and, externally, he had to conduct foreign affairs and exert influence on the surrounding areas. On the chessboard of political intrigue, the duke had become a player, and his rules of survival naturally differed from those of the pawns. The problem now was that a 10-year-old kid sat at the chessboard. Perhaps only the God of Light could predict what he would do. Therefore, both the Grand Duke of Mainz and the Grand Duke of Bane felt the need to clarify many matters with Duke Wesson to prevent the situation from developing in an unforeseen direction. The Grand Duke of Bane, in particular, had secretly supported the Allied forces in the Six-Day War with a batch of poison gas bombs. Now that the Wesson army was on the rise, he was somewhat afraid they might attack. Frederick had no intention of openly seeking revenge against the Grand Duke of Bane. After all, even if he did, he would at most find a scapegoat, much like King William, who shifted the blame onto a dead person. His priority now was to manage the territory, while prioritizing easing relations with the outside world. Therefore, the three of them now met every afternoon for tea at Frederick's seed-growing estate, or strolled and chatted in the fields. Diplomatic matters were quickly settled. The two Grand Dukes spent several days lecturing Duke Wesson on the principles of peace and solidarity with the South. Finally, they breathed a sigh of relief when Frederick assured them that he would not resort to force against their territories. That afternoon, the three of them approached the vegetable greenhouses, where farmers were pulling up the plastic film. It was clear that the Grand Dukes were all very interested in the new crops and vegetable greenhouses in Wesson. The Grand Duke of Bavaria, in particular, acted as if nothing had happened. He spent the entire day, using his seniority to bully Frederick and asking him questions, even coaxing the child. He truly acted like a grandfather. The Grand Duke of Bavaria, now in his 70s, had been handsome in his youth and possessed a strong artistic temperament, having patronized many artists over the years. Compared to veteran soldiers like the Grand Duke of Mainz, Frederick paid special attention to those who studied art, as one could never know their potential. The Grand Duke of Bavaria pointed at the rolled-up greenhouse film and said, "Wesson, how about selling me these old transparent sheets?" Frederick replied nonchalantly, "If you're going to sell them, sell new ones. There's no point in selling used goods. If you'd like, I can also send people to teach you how to build greenhouses and grow vegetables in the winter. Of course, you'll have to pay them well, since he couldn't send his vegetables to Bavaria to sell in the winter, he'd just sell slime film. The more greenhouses they built, the more film he could sell." "Really?" the Grand Duke of Bavaria said cheerfully. "Don't worry, I won't let you get away with it." Frederick's lips curled slightly, and he said seriously, "Grand Dukes, there are some things we haven't said explicitly. Since I'm young, I'll let you speak. If I'm wrong, just treat it as childish talk." The Grand Duke of Mainz smiled and said, "Then go ahead. We won't spank you if you're wrong." Frederick curled his lips, clearly annoyed at being treated like a child. However, this also had an advantage. As long as he didn't make excessive demands, the other party wouldn't get angry even if they disagreed. They would simply treat him as ignorant, not as someone with a conspiracy. So Frederick and the two archdukes sat down at the table and chairs where the farmers rested next to the greenhouse and shared his ideas with them, thus establishing the geopolitical landscape that would endure for many years. Chapter 154 Cooperative Organization. As Frederick pointed to the stone table and chairs, inviting the two elders to sit, Taro immediately led the maids over to clean the tables and chairs, covering them with a beautiful tablecloth and placing soft, comfortable cushions on the chairs. By the time the three men sat down, tea and snacks were already served. The maids brought over a kettle, towels, and a basin. The three men washed their hands and faces before beginning their conversation. Frederick placed an empty plate in the middle of the table, first placing 3 round cookies together in the center, then placing several kinds of candied fruit beside them. He dismissed all the servants and said, "All 3 of our families are rebellious against the royal family. I even broke with them, and now we're only superficially mending. The greatest threat to us comes from without. The Duchy of Bane is bordered by the Osmagian Empire to the east and south, the Duchy of Mainz by the Kingdom of Gaul to the west, and the Helvetic Confederation to the south. The Duchy of Franconia to our north and the Regents Confederation to our east are both controlled by the Osmagian Empire. They are our greatest enemies. For years, you two have sought to unify the southern region, to consolidate your forces and confront the outside world, but this has been unsuccessful due to a principled issue of leadership." He made this point directly, but the torch duchesses, seasoned political figures, simply smiled. The Archduke of Bane put down his teacup and asked with a smile, "Why, do you wish to be a feudal lord?" Though his face was smiling, his eyes were cold. On matters of principle, he would not compromise. The Grand Duke of Mainz said to him, "Don't be so nervous. This little guy has a lot of clever ideas. Maybe he can solve the problem that we 2 old men have been arguing about for over a decade." "Yes, yes," the Grand Duke of Bane said with an angry look. "Everyone knows that this little guy will marry your goddaughter one day. Then you can all bully me together." The Grand Duke of Mainz said, "I will hold a hunting event in the autumn. I invite you and your grandchildren to join. My granddaughters will be very happy." Frederick had finally seen what a seasoned politician could be. In just 2 sentences, the Grand Duke of Bane indirectly suggested strengthening ties with the Grand Duke of Mainz, and the Grand Duke of Mainz immediately agreed. Thus, the relationship between the 3 families was strengthened in the traditional way. Suddenly, a question popped into his mind. What would happen if the Grand Duke of Bane remarried the Grand Duke of Mainz's granddaughter? He didn't dare ask the question, as he would definitely be beaten to death if he did. Grand Duke Bane did not mention the marriage again, but said excitedly, "When the time comes, I will compete with you to see who has more prey." The fact that he did not refuse politely meant that he agreed. Frederick maintained a smile and spoke seriously, "I have a suggestion. The 3 of us should form a cooperative organization. All members of this cooperative organization are equal. The purpose of the organization is to strengthen mutual trust and good neighborly friendship among the 3 parties, encourage cooperation in the political, military, commercial, educational, and transportation fields, and jointly work to maintain and safeguard regional peace, security, and stability, politically. Using the cooperative organization as a platform, a formal trilateral meeting mechanism will be established. In addition to the permanent institutions of each department, regular summit meetings will be held, rotating in each party. The 3 parties will resolve all issues between them through mutual consultation in the spirit of mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, consultation, and the pursuit of common development. Militarily, the 3 parties will strengthen military trust in the border area and negotiate the mutual reduction of military forces in the border area within the framework of the cooperative organization. Commercially, the 3 parties can conduct bilateral negotiations within the framework of the cooperative organization to reduce or exempt tariffs and strengthen trade. Schools such as the University of Wessenland can be open to your territories, and tuition fees can be reduced accordingly. That's basically what I can think of, he rambled on, then took a long sip from his teacup. The 2 archdukes looked at each other and burst into laughter. The Archduke of Bane couldn't help but sigh, "I'm getting old. Young people these days are so audacious. Perhaps only a young person like you, who hasn't tasted the sweetness of power, would come up with a way to talk about profit instead of power." He then looked at the Archduke of Mainz and asked, "What do you think?" The Archduke of Mainz smiled and replied, "Let's try it. We'll know after we try it. There's no deep hatred between our 3 families. There's no need to fight to the death. We can sit down and talk about anything. We can reduce the number of troops on our border. We were previously wary of those 5 families' armies being reinforced on the border. It would benefit everyone." The Archduke of Bane nodded and said, "I think so. How about this? Our 3 border armies have regular exchanges, just as a form of mutual confirmation. How about playing football from time to time?" Frederick was bewildered by the last part, but later thought that it might be a good idea. The Grand Duke of Mainz smiled somewhat helplessly and said, "Now it's your turn to bully me." He then said to Frederick, After you invented that football, Mixing City was the first to learn it. I'm very optimistic about a match between you two." Frederick laughed along, accustomed to introducing small interludes to lighten the mood during negotiations. He then began to steer the conversation towards business cooperation. Currently, the canton of Wesson suffers from a serious shortcoming. Its mineral resources are extremely scarce, and almost all mineral raw materials must be imported. The Duchy of Mainz and the Duchy of Bavaria have mines, and Bavaria, with its many mountains, has abundant wind magic crystals, which are needed for weapons like the P-gun. Bavaria also has some fire magic crystals for boiling water, but Frederick has a captive in the castle, who is well fed and well cared for, and whose family has a large supply of fire magic crystals. Frederick now intends to deepen trade cooperation with him, importing raw materials and energy and exporting industrial products. The two Grand Dukes quickly agreeing to deepen commercial cooperation and, in principle, to mutually exempt tariffs on raw materials and industrial products. Everyone knew by now that Wesson's industrial products were in high demand. If they could buy them cheaply, they could earn a fortune, whether for their own use or exporting to neighboring countries. Although they were hostile to neighboring states like the Kingdom of Gaul and the Osmagian Empire, this didn't prevent either side from making profits before a conflict erupted. At the end of the conversation, the Grand Duke of Mainz suddenly addressed the Grand Duke of Bane, saying, "Since Wesson offers us so many opportunities to make money, why don't we just give him a hard time about Nuremberg? You're the only one who's good at playing nice." The Grand Duke of Bane scoffed, laughing. "As if I'm the bad guy, deliberately trying to make things difficult for Wesson. Alright, I'll get everyone to support Wesson." Frederick smiled broadly. The free city of Nuremberg was now in a state of chaos, with the royal family, agents of the Duchy of Mainz, and the Duchy of Bane vying for power and swaying local forces. He had originally intended to collect protection money, but the king had thrust this hot potato into his hands, attempting to provoke conflict between him and his two neighbors. Now that the leader had given his approval, the thugs who had been charging forward knew what to do. The three of them decided on the general direction, leaving the details to the subordinates to wrestle among themselves until a critical point was reached that was acceptable to all three parties. During this period, Frederick, besides arranging the army to raid Nuremberg, finally had time to spend with Maria. He even hid the unicorn he had intended for Maria in the barracks and issued a gag order, planning to surprise her in the fall. By late May, the three parties had reached an agreement on the detailed terms, and the Convention on the Cooperation Organization of the Duchy of Bavaria, the Duchy of Mainz, and the State of Wesson was officially signed and came into effect. Because these three regions are located in the upper reaches of the Rhine and Danube rivers, they are referred to as the Upper Region Cooperation Organization. With the external threat eliminated, Frederick could finally turn to domestic affairs. Chapter 155, High-Level Meeting of Wesson State, Part 1. On the penultimate day of May 1026, the first high-level meeting of the Wesson state government after the Six-Day War was held in the conference room of the Executive Council. Frederick was the first to enter the empty conference room. He took his seat, stretched, and then turned to his secretary, curiously asking, "I heard you're in love." Vanessa, who was preparing her notebook and pen for taking notes later, was startled by the sudden question. Blushing, she asked, "Why do you ask?" Frederick gloated, "I'm well informed." Then, with a sly grin, he asked, "I'm planning to lock Schmidt up for the winter. Do you mind?" Vanessa blushed even more and whispered, "Whatever." "Why are you asking me?" Then, cautiously, she asked, "Did he do something wrong?" Frederick laughed, finding a comfortable position in his chair, and muttered, "An angel, a multi-riveted steel angel, wandering over the continent." Vanessa tilted her head, her beautiful eyes filled with questioning. People attending the meeting began to arrive, and Frederick chatted with them. With his expanded territory, Frederick established several new departments, recruiting talented individuals from the new territories. The newcomers and veterans in the meeting room were easily distinguishable. The veterans all wore white shirts, dark trousers, and thermoses, while the newcomers wore traditional, brightly colored leggings and wide-sleeved, colorful shirts. This made the newcomers seem out of place, feeling uneasy. The veterans, on the other hand, were beaming with energy and vigor. This was no surprise. After the war, Frederick knighted not only the second generation of knights, such as Franz the Younger, who had distinguished themselves in the war, but also veteran officials like Administrator Frick, Tax Collector Neuer, and Judge Otto, earning knighthoods and officially becoming nobles. Furthermore, The current Wesson state was a far cry from the former Wessenland. Its territory had expanded from approximately 1,000 square kilometers to nearly 8,000 square kilometers, and its population had surged from 100,000 to nearly 400,000. Naturally, their power and influence had grown as well. The former Wessenberg government also underwent reforms, with each department being upgraded to ministries, and the officials in charge being promoted from official to minister, naturally accompanied by salary increases. Seeing everyone present, Frederick said, "Today is the first meeting of our state government. Since there are many new colleagues, please introduce yourselves and the responsibilities of your departments." The first to introduce himself was President Frick, who, within the civil service, still held a position below Frederick. Among the new faces who appeared today, the first to introduce himself was Finance Minister Erhardt, a middle-aged man with a hairline that extended to his chin. He had previously served as the treasurer of Nuremberg, a localist with a successful record and a good reputation. Consequently, Frederick appointed him to manage the finances of the entire Wessenberg state. The second newcomer was Christian, who had delivered a declaration of war in April. He had been a diplomat under Rudolf, but was dismissed and stripped of his title for delaying the declaration. Upon hearing that he would be blamed for the Allied defeat, he and his family, carrying valuables, immediately fled to Wessenberg to join the Duke of Wesen. Frederick was unfamiliar with him. But Philip, a fellow diplomat, was well acquainted with him and had confidence in his ability. So, after having Psyche take a lie detector test to confirm he was not an undercover agent, Frederick put him in charge of diplomatic affairs. The third newcomer in the conference room was an old acquaintance, Edward, a master craftsman in the Nuremberg Stonemasons Guild and the general contractor for the Carolina Canal in Wesen. He now served as Minister of Construction under Frederick. This complex, dual-party operation left Frederick unsure, but Edward stated that he would focus on his role as minister once the canal was completed. Besides these three, there was someone in the conference room today who many knew or had heard of, but who was attending a high-level meeting for the first time. Delroyd, the head of Wesson accounting firm, was also present today. Last year, he recruited professionals from the Kingdom of Unglet to open the firm. He initially audited all of the Wesson family's assets, then moved on to provide services to other chambers of commerce. Within a year, he expanded his business to Nuremberg. These Burgundy-hired Engler were renowned for their ruthlessness, professional expertise, and strict confidentiality. They had uncovered numerous problems for their clients, earning them the nickname Red Foxes. The officials were feeling a bit uneasy because Delroyd, during his introduction, had explicitly stated that Wesson accounting firm would begin auditing government finances this year at the request of Duke Wesson. Delroyd was a seldom seen, quiet voice, and due to the specialized nature of his work, he rarely interacted with others. After a brief greeting, he sat quietly. Giovanni smiled. Wesson Bank had been the most targeted by these red foxes, and now he was finally no longer the only one suffering. After everyone finished introducing themselves, Frederick said, "Let me first set the tone for future work. Our top priority for this year and next, 1027, is to establish and improve our government institutions in the new territories and compile data for all departments. Territorial development requires planning. In mid-1027, a year from now, we will begin formulating the 5-year development plan for Wesson Province, covering the period from 1028 to 1032. The officials present immediately took note. Bank President Giovanni, after taking note, asked, "Is the development plan guided by Mr. Scrooge McDuck's article in last year's Wesson Journal on leveraging regional advantages and optimizing industrial layout?" He had worked in finance for many years and had seen many landowners' so-called development efforts simply passively follow their neighbors' profitable practices. These methods often took years to learn from their neighbors. Long-term planning often fell on the merchant associations, who faced far more uncertainties and a much faster pace than the idyllic landowners. If his Chamber of Commerce grew but couldn't keep up with its competitors, it would go bankrupt before the landlord's newly planted grapes could even produce new wine. Giovanni, familiar with planning, understood that development planning required a guiding principle. He first pondered the characteristics of Wesson, quickly recalling a series of articles he'd read last year. Frederick raised an eyebrow and asked with interest, "Tell me what you think." Giovanni gathered his thoughts and said, "Although Wesson isn't large, transportation costs still account for a significant portion of production costs. Transportation costs aren't just about carriages, they include the transportation, storage, and carriages from the source of the materials to the factory. Frederick interrupted. Well said, very inspiring. Let's continue this line of thought. There were many things to address at the meeting today. The economics lecture would have to wait. Giovanni didn't mind being interrupted. Sharing the same ideas with his boss was more important. Frederick continued, let's begin today's agenda, starting with the Executive Council. Frick immediately opened his notebook and began reporting on the current work. The administrative divisions of Wesson have been completed. All officials assigned from Wesson have arrived, and officials who will be transferred to other areas have been assigned according to their wishes and by lottery. The renaming of the districts has been completed. Wessenland has been renamed Warnitz District, Eichstadt District to Willebur District, Ansbach District to Richet District, Firth District to Zerndorf District, and Rot District to Ratibor District. Frederick nodded. These new place names weren't just random ideas, they were essentially long ago names for the areas. Local geographical names like rivers with the same name commemorated that period, effectively erasing the stigma of the previous lord. No one could predict the future. Wesson would be his base, and he had to forge a stronghold. He then said, next, the executive yuan will work with the courts, the tax department, the police department, and the military to conduct a comprehensive investigation of each village. Village chiefs with misconduct must be dealt with severely and without mercy. All policies from the old territories must be implemented in the villages, and we must strive to install loudspeakers in all villages before winter. Frick wrote down all the instructions and promised to carry them out without delay. The Ministry of Finance then presented its work. Erhard, still unsure of Frederick's temperament, carefully presented the financial data up to the end of April. The report focused on military expenditures from the Six-Day War, the financial situation of the various territories, and the amount of captured spoils. Overall, the war had left Frederick extremely exhausted. However, Frederick's focus lay elsewhere. He asked in surprise, the figures for April are out? So quickly? Reviewing the financial situation and statistics of the new territories was a daunting task, and the sheer volume of calculations was prone to errors. Elhard replied, we have Professor Almight to thank for that. His calculator is incredibly useful, significantly reducing our workload and making our work much easier. Frederick's eyes widened at this, and he nearly jumped out of his chair. He had mentioned specialized calculation capabilities when he and Almight discussed other applications for the golem puppet, but that was 2 years ago, and he'd thought it was dead. Don't leave after the meeting, Frederick told Almight. He then said to Erhard, the Ministry of Finance's next task is to improve the regulations and procedures for territorial finances. They must be well defined and documented, minimizing loopholes. Then, pointing to the thermos in front of him, Frederick sternly declared, if any department buys a thermos for 10 florins, those who signed it will be hanged on the city walls. Startled, Erhard instinctively asked, Sir, how are you so skilled? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 156, High-Level Meeting of Wesson State, Part 2. Like any other man, Frederick always found ways to be a bit greedy when working for a boss. Now that he was his own boss, he was eager to drag anyone who stole his money into a fight with his supervisor. After his harsh words, the meeting continued, with Tax Minister Noy reporting on preparations for the summer tax. Frederick gave a crucial instruction, starting with the summer tax, the current tax law will be extended to the entire territory. Proper publicity efforts must be carried out. You can organize singers to compose songs about the main points of the tax law and promote them in the villages. Neuer immediately took note. Starting with the summer tax this year, the new territories would implement the same tax policy as Wesson. For tenants who are already required to pay at least a certain amount of rent, the exemption of the 30% rent collected after the harvest was a blessing. However, the existing tax collectors in those areas were of varying quality, and they saw the tax reduction as a golden opportunity to make a fortune. Frederick thought for a moment, then told little Franz, who had taken over his father's position as Minister of War that month, the army is sending troops to the villages to collect taxes with tax officials under the pretext of protecting tax grain. I'll give you detailed orders later. Little Franz immediately understood the commander's intention. These troops were being sent out for more than just protecting tax grain, there might even be bloodshed. After discussing taxation, Frederick asked Edward to first address the Ministry of Construction. Currently, there are 3 key projects in the state of Wesson: the Carolina Canal, the German Cathedral, and the Edelweiss Library. Edward reported that the Carolina Canal will enter the earthwork phase this year, with personnel arriving gradually and navigable next year. The exterior design of the German Cathedral and the Edelweiss Library is complete, land acquisition is complete, and demolition work is complete. Foundation pit excavation is now possible. Frederick's eyes narrowed, and an unprecedented aura suddenly erupted from him. He addressed Edward with great solemnity. "All work on the cathedral and library is suspended." "Huh?" everyone in the conference room exclaimed in surprise. Everyone knew these 2 projects were Frederick's top priority, and he never imagined they would stop. Frederick excitedly told Edward, "Next month, mid-June, gather all the bright, money-hungry builders to Wissenberg. I'll personally teach them how to build with the new materials. Once they've mastered it, they'll be the ones to build the cathedral and the great library. From mid-June on, my focus will be on this, until I go hunting in the Duchy of Mainz in late autumn." The elderly people in the meeting room were silent, yet with a touch of anticipation. The master always came up with something new. They wondered what he would come up with this time. But now that it was snowing and they could eat fresh vegetables, and boiling water could be used to grind flour, no one would be surprised if the master said flour could be used to build a house. Frederick gestured to Vanessa behind him, and a stack of booklets quickly appeared on the table. He picked one out and had his secretary give it to Edward, giving the rest to Almight. Seeing the principal was up to something again, Almight eagerly picked up the first book and opened it. However, his expression suddenly changed as he flipped open the pages. Looking up, he asked Frederick in horror, "Principal, what do you need such a large, rich woman's pleasure stick for?" The conference room erupted in the sounds of water spraying and coughing. Frederick's face darkened. Oh my God. Someone had already come up with his idea of using earthquake magic to make a concrete vibrator, just for a different application. "Don't worry about it," he said sullenly. "Just make it." He quickly changed the subject, saying to Edward, "Research the railway. I want you to immediately begin the alignment and land acquisition work with the executive yuan, using prisoners of war to build the roadbed." This was the advantage of being a large landowner. The land was yours, and you could use it however you pleased. If you took farmland, you could just compensate the tenants by allocating new plots elsewhere. The railway's location had been worked out. The entire Wesson state's topography was available in the military department's map room. Frederick had previously surveyed the terrain while riding Dawn and Maria through the sky, and then had the soldiers conduct a field survey, essentially finalizing the route. However, Wesson state was mountainous, making tunneling difficult and costly with current technology. While efforts were made to minimize turns, there were still many. Edward was no stranger to railways. In addition to mines, quarries also used railcars to transport large amounts of stone, so he couldn't help but ask, "Sir, are you going to build a railway like the one in the mines?" Frederick nodded and said, "Yes, you also know that the railway in the mines can transport more and faster things than ordinary horse-drawn carriages, so I decided to use railways in the territory to connect villages and towns with cities, and cities with cities, so that when the rivers freeze in winter, a large number of people and materials can be transported, and they will not be restricted by ports." Let me tell you another secret of Wesson. Although the carriages on these railways are now pulled by horses, more powerful machines will be used to pull the carriages in a few years. By then, about 100 tons of cargo can be pulled from here to the city of Nuremberg in less than 2 hours. As soon as he finished speaking, the old people in the conference room immediately asked questions non-stop. The core question was why they had to wait for a few years. The weather at the end of May was a bit hot. Frederick calmly picked up his thermos and took a sip of ice juice. Then he said, "Do you think it is so easy to produce such a huge force? Do you dare to use it without reliability testing? Those machines are used to transport goods and people. If they are put into use in a hurry and something breaks down, and people and goods are thrown down, will you compensate for it?" Now no one in the meeting room spoke. Frederick then addressed Police Minister Dominic, saying, "The police department has a heavy workload. Construction at the district, city, and town levels must be completed by the end of summer. In the fall, we must gather clues and arrest people in the winter. I don't need gutter rats on my territory." He then addressed Judge Otto, saying, "Cooperate effectively. Anyone with blood on their hands, raping, causing disability, building a building, organizing a gang with more than 5 members, or causing widespread public resentment will be hanged on the wall, their homes will be searched, and their immediate family members will be expelled from their territory. Those convicted of petty theft or extortion exceeding 1 kreutz will be sent to work alongside the prisoners of war on the railway. For every kreutz exceeding 5, they will receive an additional year of hard labor. Those convicted of less than 1 kreutz will be shackled and displayed for 10 days. Frederick paused, then added, if necessary, the city defense forces will cooperate across districts to arrest individuals. Any resistance, no matter how minor, will be executed on the spot. He then asked Ahmet, how are the textile machines? Ahmet, not expecting him to be mentioned in the security issue, was lost in thought as he pondered the information in the booklet. He paused for a moment before replying, I was planning to report back later. We're now able to weave acceptable cloth. Frederick nodded and turned to the medical director, Frank, organize the resources and manpower for the treatment of the girls in the brothel. I'll cover the expenses. Ahmet, start preparing for the textile factory. If there are any homeless girls, the factory will provide them with housing. After he finished arranging this, everyone in the conference room, save for the voices of the relevant personnel agreeing, began to speak. Triads, brothels, and the like weren't just new territory. Wessenland had always existed, and the protective umbrella was right there in the conference room. Frederick's previous main conflict had been external threats, a problem difficult to address. Now, the main conflict was internal development, and he could leverage the victory of the Six-Day War to rectify internal affairs. As for the underground order, he planned to gradually establish community organizations that would reach down to the streets to close the power vacuum. He had revealed this matter so early to see if someone could still be saved. If someone wasn't self-aware, Frederick wouldn't mind helping them to become aware. Frederick glanced coldly at the umbrella, then continued the meeting as if nothing had happened. The next meeting was the Ministry of Agriculture's turn. Chapter 157, High-Level Meeting of Wesson State, Part 2. The Ministry of Agriculture has been very busy lately, and none of the tasks Frederick assigned them were easy. The most important of these was training agricultural technicians. However, research on crops was still relatively limited these days, far less than that on medicinal plants. Matthias and his students could only study as they went along, applying the effects of other plants to their crops. Another option was pesticides. Currently, pesticides are made by boiling poisonous plants in water and spraying them on pest-infested crops. However, this method is limited by the plant's origin. For example, castor beans from the southern continent were readily available in Constantia. Grinding them and boiling them with a little salt could kill some pests, a method Matthias often used there. However, they were difficult to find in Wesson, forcing him to search for prescriptions. Frederick was at his wit's end. He only remembered Bordeaux mixture and lime sulfur, a mixture of 1 part quicklime, 2 parts sulfur, and 10 parts hot water, boiled over high heat until it turned a soy sauce-colored color. While these worked reasonably well, they also destroyed the small slimes that fed on the roots and stems of the insects. Frederick's current standards for rough agricultural technicians are to teach farmers how to avoid excessive fertilizer and pesticide concentrations, and to help collect data. He can't expect too much at the moment. Matthias reported on the plan to train 200 rough agricultural technicians this year and the preparations for improved seeds for summer and autumn planting. Enrollment for the former has been completed, but the latter is a bit more challenging due to the expansion of territories and insufficient reserves of improved seeds. Frederick said, cooperate with the executive yuan to promote improved seeds, fertilizers, and livestock and poultry farming in the new territories. Ensure sufficient seeds for domestic use before exporting them. By the way, what do you think of BASF's new fertilizer? Frederick remembered that last year, BASF discovered that using the remaining water from pressure cooker slime glue to spray on weeds could promote their growth, so he asked him to contact Matthias for research. Matthias immediately replied, that is a compound fertilizer, especially suitable for vegetables and fruit trees. The plan now is to make it into concentrated liquid for sale. Frederick thought this was not bad, and then said, I plan to make a new plowing machine this winter. You can find a few farmers who are good at using plows to help, and tell them what they are going to do in advance. You have to tell them what they are going to do in advance, otherwise it will be bad if rumors spread like last year. In the medical department, Frederick turned to ask Frank, how is the current progress of the compilation of the Handbook of Treatment of Common Diseases? Frank flipped through his notebook and answered, currently, There are 19 outstanding doctors and pharmacists who have come to Wesson territory to assist in compiling this book. There are more than 200 doctors and pharmacists who have helped us through letters. The disease catalog and diagnostic methods have been finalized. We are now selecting prescriptions, and it is expected to be finalized by the end of next year. Sir, there is something I want to discuss with you. One of my teachers wrote to ask if they can build a medical school here. Frederick replied immediately, "That's definitely no problem." Frank hesitated for a moment, and said cautiously, "The teacher and his team have some pagans." Frederick replied indifferently, "It doesn't matter. Recently, more and more pagans have come here to do business, and some have opened shops. As long as they don't preach, it's fine. How about this? If they are willing to come, let's go to the city of Nuremberg. There are many pagan merchants from the north and west there." Father Arms, "That's no problem." There was a priest in the conference room. Father Arms, the Minister of Education, was one of the more open-minded ones, and he nodded silently. "Pagans are not without their merits," Father Arms said. "In medicine, our surgical techniques are far inferior to those of the southern continent." Frank breathed a sigh of relief, nodded in agreement, and then indicated that he was done. It was now the Ministry of Education's turn. Father Arms said, "Your Excellency, there is only one most important issue in education right now. Promoting universal education in the new territories will probably take some time, as we don't have enough qualified teachers. The Ministry of Education suggests expanding the existing teacher training classes into a dedicated university for teacher training." Frederick naturally agreed without a second thought. He had never been stingy with his investment in education. The newly appointed finance minister, however, felt a bit of a pain in the arse. He scratched his bald head and said, "Sir, building a new university requires a huge investment. Would you mind reconsidering this?" To Erhard, building a school didn't seem like a big deal. Nuremberg had no public schools, only private ones. Their limited income was a long-term guarantee, a guarantee for future generations. Frederick didn't blame him. After all, he was new and didn't know much about his own policies. Father Arms, Frederick did not answer Erhard directly. "Please tell the Minister of Finance about the plan for the Wesson district." Father Arms nodded and replied, "Okay, that's what I wanted to say later. According to the plan of His Excellency the Duke and the Ministry of Education, the Wesson district will build public elementary schools in towns with a standard of approximately one school for every 5,000 residents, and local students will be free of tuition. Public comprehensive technical schools and middle schools will be built with a standard of one school for every 10,000 people. As for universities, the University of Wessenberg will add teaching buildings, student dormitories and professorial quarters on the original site to meet the needs of the growing number of students and professors." After hearing this, Erhard opened his mouth and finally said, "In this way, the expenditure will be very high." Frederick nodded and replied, "Yes, my plan is to spend at least 5 percentage points of the territory's annual fiscal expenditure on education, and increase it to between 10 and 8 percentage points each year." Erhard calculated in his mind and finally sighed, "If that's the case, in 20 years all the young people in the entire Wesson state will have attended school. That's exactly what we want." Ahmed answered him, "Currently, a large amount of the wealth of Wesson state comes from emerging industries. The foundation of industrial production is qualified workers, and it is more difficult to train a qualified worker than a qualified soldier." Frederick continued his words and said, "Erhard, when you have time, you can go to the factory with Ahmed to take a walk and learn about the operation of the factory." Erhard agreed. At this time, he found that Wesson state was not the same as the territory he was familiar with. At the Ministry of Industry, Frederick looked at Almite. "How is the standardization going?" Almite opened his notebook and replied, "The Ministry of Industry is currently building a mechanics laboratory, expected to be completed by the end of the year. Once the lab is operational, we'll first conduct mechanical tests on screws, nuts, and bearings. Once we get the data, we'll determine the relevant standards." Frederick nodded and said, "We need to do it right from the start. There will be many standards to be established later." During this war, unexpectedly, parts from P-guns made by different factories and batches were incompatible. Magazines and bayonets wouldn't fit securely, and barrel lengths differed by as much as a centimeter. There were also instances where a larger caliber barrel collided with a smaller caliber bullet, causing the bullet to fall out after a few steps when the muzzle was pointed downward. Frederick couldn't expect too much from this batch of rush goods. Now that he had time, he needed to properly rectify the situation, starting with crude industrial standardization. He asked again, Are there enough people? Of course not, Almut answered without hesitation. There's a shortage of people everywhere right now. Frederick was helpless. He couldn't summon a bunch of intellectuals, so he could only say, the Wesson Daily is being sold in many places now. Put up a job posting on the advertising page. List the job description and salary. Hopefully, someone will come. The meeting had basically ended here. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs was still a framework. Christian was recruiting everywhere, but there was a shortage of staff everywhere, so Frederick could only offer verbal encouragement. After the meeting, Frederick and Almut went to his office and grabbed a calculator to study. Chapter 158 Renting a piece of land. Don't touch this place, it's okay, just a little, be careful, you might find a few extra parts when you put it back together. I'm not that stupid, are you stupid? Surprise, surprise. Frederick finally reassembled the disassembled calculator, but when he turned it on, nothing happened. Are you stupid? Psyche scoffed at him. I told you not to touch this place. If you move it, the magic crystal's supply of mana will be cut off. Without the magic to sustain it, the little man in the bottle will naturally be doomed. Frederick sighed helplessly and asked, what should I do then? No way, Psyche shrugged. This calculator is already bricked. I have to go to All Might to flash it. Frederick collapsed on the sofa, staring blankly at the living room ceiling. All Might's calculator was essentially a golem puppet with only calculation functions, currently capable of performing arithmetic operations up to 10 digits. It converted numbers and symbols into magic signals via the keyboard, which were then input into the magic crystal, which then output the results as magic signals. The output end is the kind of color-changing crystal used on P-guns to show whether there is a bullet in the barrel. The effect is a bit like an LCD screen, and it is divided into two lines. The top is the result, and the bottom is the numbers and symbols being entered. I've never understood, Frederick asked Psyche. What exactly is the principle behind this magic brain? Psyche, sitting on the sofa next to him, reading a comic book, replied without looking up. I just told you, the man in the bottle. The magic brain uses your own soul or someone else's as a template, uses virtual soul magic to create a replica, and then stuffs it into the empty magic crystal. This virtual soul is contained within the container and behaves somewhat like a person, hence the name man in the bottle. Frederick asked in surprise, if you copy a person's soul completely, wouldn't it mean you have another identical person? Psyche raised her head and rolled her eyes at him. She raised the comic book in her hand, pointed to a character on the cover, and asked, do you recognize this person? Frederick had seen the comic book before and replied, this is Thomas's The Tale of the Two Bears, right? This character is modeled after Hasenbratz. Psyche asked, so, is the portrait on the cover the same as the real person? Frederick replied, of course not. Not only is it just a portrait, but the image is also slightly off due to the printmaking. The same goes for virtual souls, Psyche continued as she read the comic strip. Affected by factors such as the means of observation, the degree of understanding of the entity, the limitations of replication technology, the level of operators, and material restrictions, the industry has always been 50 years away from perfect soul replication for hundreds of years. So far, virtual souls have no thinking ability, lack the ability to understand, and only have abilities like conditioned reflexes. After receiving orders, they just do what their virtual memories tell them to do. Whether it's an undead skeleton or a golem puppet, it's naturally useful in combat if they just chop people down, but more complex actions become very troublesome. Another research direction is to simulate animal golem puppets and replicate animal souls, which is quite useful. Frederick understood it reluctantly after listening, and said thoughtfully, so, it can also be used to calculate many things, maybe even type automatically. Psyche asked him curiously, do you know the principle of a typewriter? I understand a little bit, Frederick replied. I remember it's a combination of connecting rods and levers. Never mind, I'll give it to them to study when I have time. He has always had a lot of ideas, but it's difficult to realize them, so he can only take it slowly. Psyche rolled her eyes at him and said, you're so lazy. Frederick said unconvincedly, you're talking about me, but you act like I'm so diligent. You only leave the castle twice a month to visit your soy sauce shop, and all you do is go back to your room and lie down all day. Psyche said nonchalantly, you'll understand when you're my age. Frederick frowned. By the time he reached her age, it was still a question whether his grave would still be there. He glanced at the new clockwork clock in the living room. It was time for evening self-study. Then, a sudden thought struck him, And he said to Psyche, "How about we have a few moves tonight?" Psyche put down the comic book and looked at him quizzically, as if asking, "Isn't it good to be alive?" Frederick shrugged and replied, "My master asked me to." Psyche closed the comic book, a cheerful smile on her face. On the training ground, Frederick had just picked up his two-handed sword when a group of elemental golems appeared around him. "Hey," Frederick shouted hurriedly, "didn't you do it yourself?" Psyche acted innocently and said, "That's how I attack." How can a lady wield a sword herself? Frederick was speechless, and then he was beaten all night long. Psyche said, "I'm doing this for your own good," while controlling the elemental puppets to hide him hard. Hiss. As Frederick lay in the tub, the warm potion irritated the bruises on his body, making him grimace in pain. The special bruise potion was very effective, and soon the pain in the area subsided. This was a daily routine for Frederick. That day, Richardnell saw him on the mountain, beheading the general and seizing the flag amidst the enemy, and his legs were shaking with fear. Since then, he has increased the intensity of his training, and every evening self-study class there is high-intensity sparring, with the intensity being determined to avoid breaking bones. "I envy you," someone in the bathroom said. "You have a master to practice with every day." The speaker was a tall girl in her early 20s, with dark blonde hair, green eyes, and a thin frame. She wore only 2 white cloths and was mixing scented oil in the bathroom. Frederick leaned his head against the tub and asked, "You're a princess too, and you know summoning magic? It shouldn't be hard to find a master to practice with, right?" The girl smiled bitterly and said, "So what if I'm a princess? I still owe you a huge ransom and want to be your slave. My father has too many concubines, 20 or 30 brothers and sisters. To the royal family, I'm just a name on the annual pension list. I can only intimidate people outside, but I mean nothing at home. If I were that rich, I wouldn't be working for Anne's batch." Frederick murmured, "Oh." By then, the scented oil was ready. Artisha easily lifted Frederick from the tub and placed him on the bed nearby. She began applying the scented oil to invigorate blood circulation and relax the meridians, while giving him a regular massage. A proper massage felt so relaxing and hypnotic that Frederick yawned. "Let me ask you something," he asked. "What are the specialties of your green island?" Artaxia replied, "What else? Just the fire crystals underground, the sheep on the surface, and the fish in the sea." Frederick had done his homework and had a good understanding of this island, located in the Arctic Ocean northwest of the continent, covering over 2 million square kilometers and boasting numerous volcanoes and hot springs. He said nonchalantly, "How about we do business? You buy fire crystals and wool from Green Island and sell them to me. I'll buy whatever I find suitable there and sell it back." Artaxia, rubbing the bruise behind his right shoulder, said helplessly, "Forget it. I don't have the resources. I can't keep the business. My territory is on Cod Island, 700 or 800 kilometers from Green Island." The cargo ship was robbed the moment it landed on Green Island. Frederick asked, puzzled, "Can't we trade in your territory?" Artaxia replied helplessly, "My territory doesn't have a port. I don't have the money to build one." By then, the bruise on Frederick's shoulder had faded, and she turned him over. "Then I'll lend you money," Frederick said. "I'll set up a trading post in your territory. I'll store and receive the goods there." Artaxia was tempted. While working in Anne's batch, she had researched the local specialties of Wessenland and knew they would sell well back home, but she ultimately shook her head. "I don't have anything to mortgage you." She shook her head. "Do you want me to mortgage myself? You haven't even fully grown your fur yet. By the time you're older, I'll be old and worthless." Frederick's mouth twitched. Despite Artaxia's current good figure, living in a high-altitude, cold region, their diet is high in oil, meat, and alcohol. After 25, they start to resemble a wine barrel. Given their age difference, bathing Frederick seemed no different from preparing large fish back home: scales, soaking to remove blood, smearing with sesame oil, coating in flour, and frying. The only difference was the lack of scaling and the subsequent 2 steps. Frederick thought for a moment and said, "Then I'll rent a piece of land. It'll be like my own territory, and I'll have the final say. I'll build a port there, split the customs duties equally, and I'll return it to you when I'm done." Artaxia quietly rubbed the bruise on Frederick's left arm, a thoughtful expression on her face. After returning him to the tub, she said, "I'll think about it." Frederick said, "Don't worry. You're a member of the sisterhood. With teacher Psyche here, I won't cheat you." He felt that Artaxia was the type who had a bit of a naivete in learning magic, suited to being a scholar, not an administrator. Otherwise, she would have immediately opposed this concession-like proposal, at least stating that no troops could be stationed there. However, Artisha had a fingernail-sized red maple leaf tattoo below her navel, the symbol of membership in the Witch Sisterhood, so Frederick didn't dare to go too far. Chapter 159 Safety First. Every construction worker must remember the 3 treasures, 4 openings, and 5 edges. Under the mid-July morning sun, 300 construction workers, wearing hard hats, lined up at the platform at the entrance of the Wesson Textile Industrial Park project site. Led by Frederick, they held a morning shift meeting. The first act was to sing his newly composed song, 3 treasures, 4 openings, and 5 edges. After a month of study, the workers had mastered the song and understood the 3 treasures, hard hats, safety belts, and safety nets, the 4 reserved openings, openings for manholes, passageways, and stairways, and the 5 edges, building edges, roof edges, balcony edges, unloading ports, and foundation pit edges. Frederick had witnessed several deaths and even more injuries on construction sites in his previous life, so he took safety very seriously. He had always started every day's lecture with a safety lecture. Now, in the audience, besides construction workers from Wesson, the Duchy of Mainz, the Duchy of Bavaria, and surrounding areas, lined the front rows with architecture professors from the University of Wessenberg, Professor Enerd, the architect of the Carolina Canal, and his students, as well as the designers commissioned by the Church of Light and the Grand Duke of Mainz to design the German cathedral and the Edelweiss Library. The clients of the cathedral and library were initially apprehensive when they heard the projects had been suspended, but after seeing cement, they were impressed by this new material and agreed to use it, so the designers were sent here to learn from scratch. This was good news for Frederick. Strong enough technicians could serve as construction workers, each leading a team of 10. Those less physically fit took turns as safety officers, receiving commissions on fines, and also served as materials clerks, quality inspectors, and budget managers. As for document clerks, a group of scribes who had lost their jobs due to the printing press were hired to fill the void. After everyone finished singing, Frederick said, "Now let's arrange today's tasks." Yesterday, the construction workers led each team in studying the blueprints. Today's work involves laying out the lines according to the blueprints. Laying out the lines is extremely important. If the lines are crooked, the entire building will be crooked. At best, it will affect the aesthetics, and at worst, it will cause the building to tilt and collapse. Before we begin today's work, let me reiterate again, anyone who dares to urinate or defecate anywhere will have their tools smeared with chili oil. Alright, all construction workers, led the workers to work. With a wave of his hand, the people wearing various hard hats dispersed. Frederick breathed a sigh of relief on the stage and returned to his office. He hadn't expected so many people to come. Managing them was a major challenge. Just eating, drinking, defecating, urinating, and sleeping was enough of a headache, so he had to adopt a military-style management approach. Laying out the lines today wasn't a difficult task. The craftsmen weren't primitive people, they knew the ropes, so he didn't need to keep a close eye on them. When he returned to his office in the wooden house, Taro had already brewed a cup of tea in a thermos and placed it on the table. He was sitting there reading a novel. A red file folder on the desk held documents from Wesson State. Vanessa had brought them there early this morning. Frederick would deal with them first and take them tomorrow when Vanessa arrived with new documents. These documents weren't important, but the most serious was that during the recent summer tax collection, a dozen tax collectors from the new territory attempted to exploit the change in tax policy by collecting rent at the old rate and then paying it back at the new rate, pocketing the difference. They bribed the accompanying soldiers to do this, and were ultimately executed on the spot. Frederick ordered the bodies to be hung and displayed in various villages, then began to address the construction site. The idea for the industrial park had been proposed last year, and design work had begun there. However, plans couldn't keep up, so the first phase of the industrial park was dedicated entirely to the textile factory. The reason was simple: back home in Altisha, a single cotton coat was expensive, enough to pass down through generations, and could easily be exchanged for fire magic crystals. Given the preponderance of female workers in textile factories, the industrial park was located near the smelting plant, which predominantly employed male workers. It primarily consists of 10 factory buildings and 2 warehouses, all constructed with reinforced concrete frames, featuring a 5x8 meter column grid, 5 meter floor heights, a length of 50 meters, and a width of 16 meters. The park also includes a 3-story frame office building, 2 cafeterias, a 10-meter high water tower, a parking lot, and several public restrooms. Upon completion, a new workers' village will be built between the industrial park and the smelting plant, primarily consisting of tube-shaped buildings. Frederick carefully reviewed the factory building blueprints. The design, inspired by his university coursework, was ultimately deemed safe. Given the added safety margins provided by winter snow accumulation on the roof, it should be fine. His biggest concern now is the quality of the materials. The cement is generally acceptable, but the main concern is the rebar. Current steel quality is somewhat variable due to production constraints, and alloy steel is unavailable, requiring considerable effort to calculate the required rebar. Rebar requires welders, and steam engine manufacturers are hiring. A monthly salary of 2 gold coins has attracted many mages capable of simple fire magic. Such high wages, without having to fight on the battlefield, have them packing their bags and rushing to Wessenland, where they are currently learning to weld rebar at the blacksmith's shop. The same salary has also attracted many earth magicians. Those with average skills are busy at the canal construction site, while those with more advanced skills are at the cement factory researching whether earthquake magic can be applied directly to concrete, replacing vibrators. With an hour left before lunch, Frederick, as he had done in his previous life, donned his hard hat and went to the construction site to inspect the morning's work. Carriages were constantly arriving at the construction site, bringing in shovels, barrels, hammers, nails, planks, and other items. Frederick walked to the warehouse and saw that the items were neatly stacked. Then he erupted in anger, roaring furiously at the porters in front of a pile of formwork. "What's wrong with you, Wessenland district swear words? I told you yesterday that nothing should be piled higher than 2 meters, and it's already, Wessenland district swear words, almost 3 meters." The porters had just unloaded the formwork from a horse-drawn cart. After unloading half the cart, they had reached 2 meters, but they were too lazy to move and continued piling. In Frederick's previous life, another construction site of his company had collapsed due to excessively piled materials, killing someone he knew, and he had a traumatic experience with the situation. These porters were hired from the Dock Workers Guild and were experienced. One of the older workers smiled and said, "Master, it's okay. We'll just be careful. We used to pile things this high at the docks." Frederick asked the men nearby expressionlessly, "Do you agree?" Some nodded, others said yes. Frederick ignored them, waiting quietly for the guildmaster, who had heard him curse, to come over. He pointed at the men and said expressionlessly, "Those few, get out of the construction site immediately." Without even turning back, he left, not giving them a second thought. Frederick considered the workers on the construction site to be his seedlings, nurturing future generations of construction workers through their words and deeds. If someone were to take safety lightly at this moment, the consequences for the future would be immeasurable. The incident caused only a small ripple among the workers, and when they saw that lunch was chicken stew with cream, they all forgot about it. Chapter 160, Fighting Until Dark. Wessenland District swear word, "Can this be done?" Frederick was stunned by the scene before him. Under Professor Einhard's direction, a high-powered slurry pump powered by a steam engine was stationed next to the excavation pit. Several students connected long sections of pipes to the ground and cast a mire spell on the surface. The once solid soil transformed into swamp mud, which was sucked away and discharged into a carriage waiting beside the slurry pump. Soon, the mud in the carriage lost its strength and turned back into mud. This mud would be loaded onto ships at the nearby docks and taken north to the riverside swamps between the former Rothberg and the current city of Ratibor. Admittedly, this method of excavation was quite efficient, though it was quite demanding on the magician. By noon, several students, after a morning of mire spells, were so exhausted they could barely lift their spoons. Frederick hurriedly ordered the kitchen to serve them chicken legs. The food at the construction site was not bad, but the work was physically demanding, and if they weren't full, they couldn't do it. Today's lunch consisted of barley porridge, steamed bread, fish, cheese, vegetable soup, and tea. Frederick ate like everyone else. Professor Einhard sat with Frederick, and as they ate, he explained the art of microorganisms and its applications. Frederick curiously asked, "Can microorganisms be used on rock? If granite could be liquefied and then restored, then what was the point of cement?" Professor Einhard replied, "No, that's impossible. Microorganisms only works on loose surfaces like soil and sand. It can only reduce the hardness of hard rock, which is used for stone mining and carving. In principle, The magical element fills the voids within, liquefying them. The most obvious example is that the harder the ground, the greater the force required to achieve the same effect. Frederick nodded, feeling a little regretful. That afternoon, he planned to teach the carpenters how to cut and nail formwork. However, upon hearing how simple it was, the carpenters politely asked him to step aside and stay out of the way, lest someone's hammerhead fly off without securing it tightly. Frederick had no choice but to leave it to the professionals. However, he soon found work, instructing the workers at the rebar yard on how to bend rebar. Professor Einhard was also there, watching the workers work but seemingly lost in thought. Upon noticing Frederick, he said, "President, I've calculated that if we have enough raw materials and manpower, we can build a factory building in just 30 days. A residential building like that, with just one floor, would only take 15 days, not counting the foundation." Frederick nodded slightly. He wasn't sure about the current construction speed, so he hadn't drawn a bar chart, but his own experience suggested it was about right. He looked at the workers in the rebar yard and said, "I'm having everyone do a little bit of everything now. Firstly, to see who excels at what, and secondly, to make them knowledgeable. These people are seedlings. Each of them will lead 3 or 5 more, and in a few years, we'll have a lot of construction workers." The construction industry has a huge market. Oak City, the seminary, the cathedral, the large library, and the factory will provide enough for us to build for many years. At the same time, construction technology must keep pace with development. This road is endless. Professor Einhard nodded repeatedly and sighed. The combination of steel and stone has revolutionized the construction industry, but it also brings huge challenges. We still have a lot to research. President, please increase research funding for our School of Architecture. Frederick's mouth twitched. These professors really seized every opportunity to ask for funding. He replied, "No problem, write a report to the vice president." He didn't bother giving Professor Einhard the chance to ask for too much. The construction site was generally progressing smoothly. The excavation of the foundation pit was on schedule, and then the ground was compacted, the cushion layer was placed, the rebar was placed, and the formwork was nailed. There was no secrecy here. Frederick chuckled when someone could copy it at a glance, thinking it meant a new customer for steel and cement. A lot of people had come to visit in the past few days, including a group of high-ranking officials from the state of Wessenland and senior officials retained by the new territory to show their faces in front of the leaders. Even Thomas had come to collect materials, followed by a man wearing sunglasses, Hasenplas. Many children who read comic books would recognize him now. No matter what world it is, the appearance of a beautiful woman on a construction site always makes the entire scene pause. "Why aren't you shielding yourself from the sun?" Katie spotted Frederick in a red hat in the crowd. "Why are you wearing such thick clothes?" The sun in late July was scorching. Like the other workers, Frederick wore a sturdy long coat and trousers, with a towel covering the back of his helmet. Frederick looked up, spotted Katie in her hard hat, smiled, and replied, "This way you won't be afraid of the sun. Why are you here today?" "I'll be busy for a while," he continued, tying rebar with thin wire. He still had the skill he'd earned his tuition since high school, and his speed was unmatched on the entire construction site. Several workers gathered around him, watching intently as the expert worked. After Frederick had tied a circle of stirrups around the main beam reinforcement, he said to the workers, "You guys practice on your own for now. I'll be back later." As soon as he emerged from the pit, Katie pulled a handkerchief from her purse and wiped the sweat, rust, and dirt from his face. "You haven't been home for so long, how come you're so dirty?" Katie complained as she wiped. "You're still stinking with sweat, and you look like a monkey. Did you eat and shower properly?" Then, she pulled a candy from her purse and popped it into Frederick's mouth. Frederick simply smiled and said nothing more, preparing to take Katie back to the office. The scene was too chaotic. He himself was actually puzzled. The work that had been exhausting in his previous life was still exhausting now, yet he was still willing to do it. Thinking about it, perhaps it was some kind of memory of his hometown. Just then, Professor Einhard approached and excitedly said to Frederick, "Principal, the ground beams for factory number 1 have begun to be poured." Frederick immediately followed him, sending Katie to the office first. Katie, curious about what they were doing, watched from the side under her parasol. Beside factory number 1, a row of machines stood. A large metal bucket, seemingly large enough to easily fit Frederick, sat on its shelf, its opening facing upwards. Next to it was a magic reciprocating machine. Frederick was standing by one of the mixers, watching as workers used wooden buckets to sequentially pour measured amounts of gravel, cement, and sand into the machine. Then, the magic reciprocating machine started, turning a rubber roller, which in turn rotated the drum. After the dry materials were thoroughly mixed, water was added and stirred for about 2 minutes. The machine stopped, and a worker turned a turntable so that the drum mouth faced downward, pouring concrete into a prepared bucket truck. Frederick immediately had the slump tested and test blocks made. The final slump was around 130 millimeters, considered acceptable. Workers began mixing the concrete continuously, and as soon as it was ready, they immediately used bucket trucks to pour it between the formwork. Workers were nearby preparing and transporting materials from the warehouse to ensure that construction would not be interrupted due to material shortages. With the experience of laying the subgrade, the site appeared to be in perfect order, with no further problems such as car crashes. Frederick arrived to watch, and Katie followed, moving her parasol over his head. Truckloads of concrete were poured into the formwork, while a magician cast a spell nearby. Fist-sized ochre balls of light slammed into the concrete. A moment later, a large area of concrete began to vibrate, emitting bubbles that lasted for about half a minute. Frederick, holding a bar, periodically poked and prodded the concrete, checking for any delamination. The results were promising. Earthquake spells could replace the vibrator, all it took was careful control of the timing and intensity. The spell's low power and low magician consumption were minimal. However, the formwork needed strengthening, especially when pouring the floor later, or it might collapse. Everyone on the construction site was fully engaged today. By the time the ground beams for Building 1 were all driven, covered with linen, and watered, it was already dark. Frederick was in a state of euphoria. When the work was finished, he instinctively reached for his phone to call Fatty Liu for some fried noodles, but all he had in his pocket was the bag of gummy candies Katie had slipped him before she left. The midsummer evening breeze was a bit hot, drying the sweat from his clothes after a while, making him a bit irritated after a day's work. He sighed and invited everyone to the cafeteria for a late-night snack. He had prepared cold beer for tonight. As for the excess concrete, it was all taken to the main entrance to harden the pavement. Chapter 161 Visiting Old Friends. The weather was growing increasingly hot. While Frederick was leading his workers to address the mold expansion issue during the column casting, a distinguished guest arrived at a manor outside Cologne. The guest, acquainted with the owner, asked the manor's wife where he was. Then, carrying a bottle of wine, he entered the study, poured 2 crystal glasses from the tea cabinet, and placed them on the desk. The golden yellow wine exuded the aroma of apples with a hint of mint, and the crystal clear glasses were filled with bubbles. Grand Duke Dalberg of Mainz, seated in a chair across from the desk, said with a sullen look, "Please chill my wine. You're not broke, so why don't you install an air conditioner in your study? You're suffering in this heat. If you don't have money, just tell me and I'll give you 2. Beecher, the burning mage and head of the Royal Mage Corps of the Rhine Confederation, didn't even look up. He continued writing and drawing with one hand while picking up a glass of cider with the other. The glass, left on the table, grew hot in the blink of an eye, steam rising with the aroma of wine. Dalberg continued to chatter on and on. "Alice, I thought I would mediate this time and help you lower the ransom. I didn't expect you to run away. What a pity. I wanted to make a profit from the difference." Beecher still ignored him until Dalberg asked, "Alice, I heard that your phlogiston theory was overturned by this little guy Frederick." This was very stimulating. Beecher suddenly raised his head and said seriously, "The phlogiston theory has not been overturned. He just discovered problems that we have not yet been able to explain." Dalberg showed a smile at the corner of his mouth. He picked up the hot fruit wine on the table. A ring on his hand flashed, and the wine immediately became cool and refreshing. He took a sip of the sweet and sour apple cider and said provocatively, "What about the double-slit experiment and the fire element? Have you found an explanation for it? I heard that other magicians have also experienced corresponding phenomena when using other magic elements for experiments." Beecher looked at his old friend of decades in confusion and asked, "Why, you are 80 years old and you are actually interested in academic research on magic, you don't know?" Dalberg asked in surprise. "Weissenberg University has published a magazine called Magic, which contains many papers on magic research. These are the latest topics of conversation," Beecher said curiously, and Dalberg began to show off proudly. "I also wrote a paper on whether the fire element is a particle or a wave. The magazine replied that it will be the first article published in this month's issue of the magazine. Let me tell you, the ranking of articles in this magazine is very particular. The more important articles are placed at the front, and the first one is the most important article of this month. The burning mage's head was filled with questions. This guy, boasting about magic, had always said things like, I don't need to study magic, I can just hire a magician when I need it. If his father hadn't whipped him, he really wouldn't have learned anything. And now, this guy can actually publish a paper on magic, and on the cutting-edge fields of particle theory and wave theory. It just doesn't seem real. Hey, Beecher asked with a frown, did you sell someone's paper and publish it under your own name? Slander. Dahlberg widened his eyes in an instant. You slandered me because of jealousy, Beecher sneered and said calmly, don't blame me for not reminding you that magicians love to play tricks on rich people like you. They will leave loopholes in the results and run away with the money. Then you will be embarrassed. Don't tell me what you wrote. I'll ask someone to buy the magazine back. If there's any problem, I will be the first to submit an article to refute and ridicule you, Dahlberg replied confidently. You can try it. Beecher suddenly felt unsure when he saw him so confident, because many magic experiments are very expensive, and these rich people who have mines at home may really make some new discoveries by spending money. He stopped discussing academic matters, lest he get upset when discussing experimental funding. Instead, he asked, why did you find the time to come to me? Dahlberg took a sip of cider and said, I came to tell you about my published paper, and to see His Majesty William. Beecher understood that the situation in the royal family after the Six-Day War was not good. The king, in particular, seemed to be in a state of mental distress since waking from his coma. However, information was kept secret, and the various princes were waiting to see which way the wind would blow. How is the king's health? He asked. I don't have any information either. Dahlberg took another sip of cider and, instead of asking about the king's condition, asked, I heard you're working for Frederick. Beecher understood immediately. The Archduke of Mainz's words carried weight. If he said the king was well, it meant he was truly well. If he said there was something wrong with the king, even if there was nothing wrong, there would be something wrong. Everyone knew that if the king didn't say he was fine when he might be ill, it meant that there was indeed something wrong. Beecher gently placed the gold-dipped pen in his hand on the pen holder, leaned back in his chair and thought for a moment, then asked his old friend, do you have any job with low salary and high pay? Dahlberg rolled his eyes at him and replied, how about the job of the Grand Duke of Mainz? It's not impossible. Beecher pretended to seriously consider the feasibility, but there won't be any trouble if you put a piece of wood in that position. Maybe it will be better than the current one. It's a waste of talent for Minord to do it, Dahlberg said unhappily. That's really unfair. Then he stopped joking and said, your nerd can go to Wesson. Their translation court is in need of talents who know multiple languages. Beecher took the wine glass and took a sip of cider, savoring the minty coolness between the sour and sweet taste, then pointed to what he had just written on the desk and said, I plan to let the third child go to Wesson. Wesson plans to use magic to make steel and boil water. I've studied it. As long as the efficiency of using magic elements is improved, it is feasible. I'm sorting out some of my ideas now. I'll give them to the third child and let her tinker with them. Dahlberg narrowed his eyes slightly and stared at Beecher intently, as if he could see through him. Beecher, unfazed, raised his glass and studied his cider. Dahlberg asked him, would you be willing to send your precious little daughter to Wesson? Beecher nodded gently. A smile appeared on the corner of Dahlberg's mouth. He pinched his chin and said, well, she's alone there and doesn't know anyone. I'll let someone in my family take care of her, Beecher said nonchalantly. I don't care about the children's affairs. Dahlberg asked him again, where is your eldest brother? Beecher took a sip of wine and replied with a sigh, I asked him to go back to the territory. I'm afraid there will be fewer and fewer peaceful days. The conflicts between the Piast Kingdom and the Osmoga Empire in the Bohemian region are becoming more and more frequent and fierce. A war is inevitable. If the Osmoga Empire loses or shows signs of decline, the princes they control in the east will have to reshuffle. The war cannot be stopped, and it will definitely affect us. Dahlberg drank the cider in the glass in a big gulp and sighed deeply. He thought for a moment and said, I'm planning to upgrade the crossbowmen in my territory to riflemen. I'll have Wesson people come for training next year. Should your family send some men as well? Really? Beecher was shocked. He had witnessed a final battle of the Six-Day War from beginning to end and was familiar with the Wesson army's weapons. Dahlberg shrugged and replied, not the rifles used by the main army that can fire a large number of bullets at a time. These are folding rifles that can only fire a single round. They're sold in large quantities by the public and are excellent for defending cities. Beecher thought more about it and realized that this was understandable. No one would sell their most important weapon. Buying a civilian version would be a good deal. By the way, he asked, can you help me buy some high-yield wheat seeds in Wesson? Dalberg smiled wryly. Not this year. They don't even have enough in their own territory. I can't buy any. Maybe next year. Beecher had nothing to say, he could only wait another year. He suddenly asked seriously, how far do you think Wesson can go in the future? I don't know. Dalberg poured cider into his empty glass. Maybe it will stop here, or it may exceed our imagination. It's hard to say. If he swallows up the neighboring Duchy of Franconia and the Regensburg Alliance before he is 25 years old, then no one in the Rhine Alliance can stop him, and maybe he can restore the glory of the Empire. Beecher nodded slightly. Chapter 162, Reward of 500 Gold Coins. The aroma of roasted whole lamb filled the construction site. Sausages were fried to a crisp, pork knuckles were stewed to tender tenderness, and a light steam rose from the offal and vegetable soup. The still warm bread exuded the scent of rosemary, and glasses of ice-cold beer were covered in water droplets. The cooks were swatting flies at the tables, waiting for the workers to arrive for their meal. A banner hung under the eaves of factory building number 1, inscribed in yellow on a red background in the local language, "Good luck with the roofing." As hundreds of people watched, Frederick installed the last tile on the roof, and the next moment, cheers echoed through the air. Standing on the roof, Frederick pressed his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "I won't say any more," he shouted. "The feast begins." Everyone burst into laughter and headed towards the cafeteria. Frederick didn't rush down, but sat on the roof, a smile he had never worn before on his face. Building such a building was no easy task. It all started with steel being smelted in a crucible in the blacksmith's shop, followed by bearings, and then progressed to rolling mills and steam engines, ultimately leading to the development of rebar, cement, and mixers. Building this factory wasn't easy either. The molds expanded when casting the columns, the concrete floors cracked due to poor curing, the column bases developed honeycombs and attempts to mortar them in the middle of the night, tools thrown onto the scaffolding fell and injured themselves, and workers trapped themselves in rebar. There was an endless stream of problems, but thankfully, no one died. "Why aren't you going to the party?" Richardnell appeared on the roof. "I'll be there soon," Frederick replied. "Sit here for a while." Richardnell sat down beside him, patted his head, and said with a smile, "What a sense of accomplishment." Frederick nodded. "I understand," Richardnell said, looking at the half-built factory building number 2 not far away. "Back then, when I was only 2 steps away from becoming a sword saint, I couldn't find anyone to rival me. I was so proud of myself, I thought I was invincible." Frederick understood what his master was going to say and asked, "Who woke you up then?" Richardnell shook his head, a look of nostalgia on his face. "I don't know. I only know it was an old priest passing by. He looked like his life, like a candle in the wind, ready to be snuffed out at any moment. That day, I was fighting with a few people on a bridge and almost destroyed it. The people around didn't dare to intervene. The old priest just threw a punch at us. When I came to my senses, I was lying in the reeds by the river. She preached to us from noon until the next morning, and then she left. I've been asking around for years, but all I know is that she was probably an ascetic monk. Beyond that, I don't know anything." Frederick nodded, understanding his master's meaning. "Let's go." Richardnell patted his shoulder. This apprentice was very smart, so there was no need for detailed explanation. On the way to the cafeteria, Richardnell said again, "I'm going to be away for a year or two. I'll leave my studies to Grandma Topsec during this time." Frederick was stunned for a moment, then realized what was going on and asked with a smile, "Sister Katie is having a brother or sister?" Richardnell nodded with a smile and said, "I wasn't there when Katie was born. And it would be unreasonable not to be there this time. By the way, you can choose the name." Frederick pinched his chin and thought for a while. After a while, he said, "If it's a girl, let's call her Monica, and if it's a boy, let's call him Robert." Richardnell thought for a moment and nodded. "Good, that's it." He chuckled twice and said, "When can you go over there and explore and broaden your horizons? Mafia really wants to meet you. I have a suggestion. Settle the territory for a few years and then go out and explore the world as an ordinary person for a few years to experience it." Frederick replied, "We'll talk about it in a few years. By the way, you can visit Manuel before you leave. He's been researching canned fruit lately. Artisha and the others haven't seen these fruits in the north. If we can southern oranges and other fruits and sell them in the north, they'll be very popular. Travel was a common practice for the nobility. Nobles with large territories would regularly tour their domains, hearing cases from various regions and inspecting their territories as a circuit court. Purposeful travel also strengthened relationships between lords and vassals, relatives, and friends. Frederick often accompanied his parents to visit neighboring castles. Long journeys were a way to broaden one's horizons, gather information, and make friends and connections with the nobles along the way. Upon returning from a trip, one would be the center of attention at salons and banquets, with everyone eager to hear stories of one's travels and the new friends one made. Frederick also wanted to travel, experience the local customs, and learn about the people. However, due to the internal instability of his domain and his young and charming appearance, he could easily be turned into a commodity. He would have to wait. His plan was to wait until he was 16 or 17, and if both the internal and external environment permitted, he would go for a walk outside. By the time the two of them reached the cafeteria, everyone was already eating happily at the long table. The sounds of chewing, toasting, and boasting were endless. Today was a great day for the construction site because of the roof completion. Many people went for a stroll into the city after eating and drinking, while some crossed the river to watch the afternoon football game. Frederick still had things to do. He and Ahmet watched Schmidt and his men lay out the lines and position the machines in the factory, preparing to move them in. Oh, right, Frederick remembered, is the new clutch ready? Previously, when steam engines were used to drive several steel mills, they found that it was impossible to stop a single mill. After some research, someone came up with a method of using rollers to adjust the belt tension to make the belt slip and move the belt to an idling wheel to realize the function of the clutch. That's not difficult, Ahmet replied. The Benz factory has solved it. They use a bowl-like structure, two parts, one large and one small, nested together. When they were locked together, one drives the other, but when they're loosened, the power stops. The friction between the two parts is replaceable. If they wear out, just replace them with new ones. Frederick nodded gently. Demand drives technological development, and when profit drives it, someone will find a solution. Creating something from scratch is the key. While improving something can be slowly solved through long-term practice. Ahmet said again, Principal, Diesel has been researching something important recently, and he is probably going to ask you for money. Frederick smiled and replied, That's good, I'm just afraid that I won't be able to spend the money. Then he said, I plan to wait until this is completed, and then assign a group of people to build two larger special factories nearby. One is for you, specializing in the production of various machine tools. The other is a heavy machinery factory specializing in the production of machines. I think Schmidt should be in charge. I have a plan. Heavy industry and raw material processing will still be placed here, and the newly added light industry will be dispersed to other areas. As the Minister of Industry, Ahmet is now responsible for planning the industrial layout. He quickly understood what the leader meant. Important industries should be placed in the most reliable places, and industries that can provide a large number of jobs will be dispersed. Oh, right, Frederick suddenly remembered. How could I have forgotten that? Schmidt, who happened to be nearby, twirling the end of a measuring tape, heard this and immediately turned around and asked, Principal, have you come up with a new machine? Frederick nodded and replied, A machine that sews clothes. Do you have any ideas? Schmidt didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at Professor Almeida and switched places with a man holding the measuring tape. Frederick understood. It seemed Almeida had had this idea before, and it had probably not only failed but also become a joke. Almeida said nonchalantly, I once wanted to make a golem sew clothes, but it failed. Frederick shrugged and said thoughtfully, I will personally publish a reward in the newspaper to the whole world for a sewing machine. Let's set the reward at 500 florins. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 163 Visitors from the South. 1. A massive fleet arrived in Wesson, and Frederick left the construction site to attend to it. Hundreds of brown-skinned foreigners with curly black hair and eyes that ranged from black to gold arrived aboard. They disembarked, carrying large and small bags, chattering about everything around them. Seeing these people, Frederick felt they didn't resemble the rebels exiled by Madame Sophie, but more like a group of tourists from a certain island nation he had joined before his time travel. Their clothing was quite interesting. The men's suits were Wesson-style suits, primarily made of white cotton and unbleached linen, but with striking yellow or blue leaf and feather patterns adorning the cuffs, collars, and hems. The women wore darker sleeveless dresses, tied with colorful belts at the waist, with the overhang draped down the front. Over them, they wore light-colored tulle jackets. They also wore a tulle headband to secure the tulle. The leaders of both sides soon met at the dock, and Frederick saw that the other man was in his 50s, resembling a scholar. Someone had given them 2 weeks' notice, and Frederick had prepared a hotel for them to stay in and arranged for a bank representative to exchange currency for them. Finally, he instructed them to take bilingual maps and bilingual conversation cards with daily phrases, prepared at the hotel front desk. Hearing this, the family's patriarch, Imhotep, asked in disbelief, speaking a slightly awkward Rhenish dialect, "Is that all?" No other conditions. They had thought they might not be mistreated upon their arrival, but they would inevitably be under house arrest. But that wasn't the intention at all. Frederick nodded and replied, "Yes, that's all." "Oh, just stop preaching." Having received so many favors from Madame Sophie, he naturally wouldn't treat them as prisoners. He had simply transferred a regiment back to Weissenberg a few days ago. Imhotep immediately said, "We will convert." "I understand," Frederick nodded. "The ceremony will be held on the autumnal equinox next month. There are so many people, so it'll take some time to prepare." Imhotep expressed his understanding. Then, one of his tribesmen approached to say they needed to handle the unloading of cargo from the ship. Although Frederick didn't understand, he instructed Foreign Minister Christian to coordinate the matter. Then, "This is my granddaughter, Susan," Imhotep said, pulling a 6 or 7-year-old girl from behind him. "It's too chaotic here at the docks. Could you please take care of her?" He disappeared, leaving Frederick and the girl staring at each other in wide-eyed disbelief. Frederick noticed that the girl's eyes were also golden, almost identical to those of Madame Sophie. Susan simply stared at Frederick curiously, saying nothing. Frederick smiled faintly, then turned and asked Taro to take care of the girl while he and his guards went to see the unloading of the cotton. This time, the cotton was still in unseated bowls, compacted and packed in sacks. Such cotton-carrying fleets would appear at the docks of Wesson every 3 to 5 days, unloading their cargo and loading up with local specialties before departing the next day. Frederick suddenly heard several sailors pointing and talking in Pulan, just loud enough for him to hear. "Sailor A, is he the Duke of Wesson?" Sailor B, "No way. He looks like his fur hasn't even fully grown." Sailor C, "He couldn't possibly have killed a general among tens of thousands of people, could he?" Sailor A, "It must have been someone else. I wonder how scared he was back then." Frederick glanced at a man on a distant ship. He held on to the side of the ship with both hands, wearing only linen trousers. His bare upper body revealed a muscular build. His shoulder-length blonde hair hung freely, and his deep blue eyes were intense, like a lion sizing up its prey. Sailor A, still oblivious to the crowd, said, "I think he's just seeking fame and reputation. How could he do such a thing when he's barely grown all his hair?" Sailor B nodded in agreement, "I think so. Many masters take credit for others' achievements and claim them as their own. He must be one of those shameless people." Sailor C said, "He's so shameless, he might even kill the people who actually made the contributions." Frederick curled his lips slightly, asked the guards to stay, and walked towards the cargo ship alone, as if nothing had happened. His eyes were fixed on the lion-like man on the ship, seemingly unconcerned about the 3 sailors who were slandering him. Seeing him like this, the sailors became even more brazen in their words. As Frederick passed by them, he drew his revolver from his waist with his right hand and, without even turning his head, shot each of the 3 men in the head. He waved his hand nonchalantly, signaling the guards to keep quiet, and then boarded the ship. Frederick approached the man calmly, leaning on the side of the ship like him, looking toward the harbor. "Hayreddin?" Frederick asked. He had previously inquired about the kingdom of Kush, where Madame Sophie lived. The man before him was the Ayyubid dynasty's naval vassal south of the Inner Sea, serving as a pirate on the odd days of the month and as a sailor on the even days. The Inner Sea was now divided among 4 factions. Hayreddin reigned supreme in the south, Pietro of the Tarragona kingdom controlled the northwest, and Hedam of the Ghazi Empire dominated the east. Paolo, caught on the middle, guarded the coast of the kingdom of Sardinia. However, These were too far from Frederick. Even if he wanted to seize the seaport, he would have to fight the loose alliances of nobles and principalities to the north. To seize the inner sea outlet, he would have to destroy the entire Osmoga Empire along the Danube, a task far too difficult. "It's me," Hayreddin replied. Frederick said calmly, "I think that if both sides want to cooperate, openness and honesty are the most important." "What do you think?" Hayreddin said in a deep voice. "Those three are Hedim's people." Frederick thought to himself that this was true, and then said, "Then, I don't think you will think that if I kill these little bugs, it means that Hedim will be my enemy. As long as the benefits are enough, the kingdom of Kirsch will cooperate with me even if I kill you." Hayreddin turned his head and looked at him deeply, and said straight to the point, "Madame Sophie wants to buy weapons." "Okay," Frederick replied immediately, "you can take some samples back for free this time." Now he began to export folding rifles and steel ball bombs made of black powder to friendly countries. The Grand Duke of Mainz and the Grand Duke of Bane have already placed orders. One more rich man will make him laugh so hard that his face will cramp. Hayreddin was a little surprised by his generosity. He and Mrs. Sophie thought that he would put forward many conditions, but he agreed directly and even sent samples. So they asked, "What do you want?" Frederick replied, "Food, minerals, cotton, magic crystals, spices, gold, gems, honey, and medicinal herbs are all fine." Hayreddin said, "These are all no problem. If there are enough weapons, these are easy to get. However, our ships must pass through the waters controlled by Hedim to come here. We must defeat him to expand the scale of transportation." Frederick nodded, thinking that maybe it would be okay to sell a little of another kind of weapon. Chapter 164 The Situation in the South. Dang, dang, dang. On a scorching summer day, beside a blazing fire, sweat-beaded arms gripped hammers, hammering a red-hot iron rod into a round shape in a mold. Hayreddin was an expert at his craft. From the rhythmic, uniform hammering, one could tell this blacksmith had reached the pinnacle of fine craftsmanship, lacking only experience and a moment of enlightenment to become an epic blacksmith. Nearby, another blacksmith slowly bored a deep hole in the hammered iron rod with a hydraulic drill, preparing for the next step. Hayreddin watched intently, concluding that even if he hired someone to make the barrel himself, the cost would likely be much higher. Frederick's expression curved slightly as he led the customer through the production process of the folding rifle, eventually leading to a showroom where shelves held dozens of exquisitely decorated double-barreled shotguns and revolvers. He said to Hayreddin, "Pick one for His Majesty Yuan and one for Madame Sophie." These gold and silver-encrusted guns were still powerful, and were meant to be given as gifts. Frederick advertised them, asking Hayreddin to select some for Madame Sophie and her son. Hayreddin quickly finished his selection. Frederick took a large revolver from the shelf and handed it to him, saying, "This is for you. My master used the same model, just with slightly different decorative patterns." "Really?" Hayreddin faltered for a moment. "Really for me?" The story of Richardnal's slaying of a mage in Constantinople spread throughout the inner sea, and the weapon he used was a source of much speculation. Hayreddin, of course, understood that using the same weapon as the swordmaster didn't make him a swordmaster himself. However, once he carried this weapon, he became the most impressive man on the sea, bar none. Hayreddin offered no words of thanks, but instead solemnly promised, "You can contact me for future inland sea affairs. I have some connections in the North Sea." Frederick smiled and asked, "What if I want to get involved in inland sea shipping?" Hayreddin gave him a deep look and replied, "The inland sea is very deep. You can't handle it." He added, "If you're willing to cause trouble for the Ghazi Empire in the east, I can help." Frederick smiled and replied, "I'm just thinking about it." He needed to make plans for the sea, but he hadn't yet figured out how to do it, and he didn't have the resources to do so at the moment. However, he could still get involved in shipbuilding. He could start with small inland sailboats to gain experience, while also researching propellers. If conditions were right, he could try paddle steamers. South of the Willowboard district in eastern Wesson, there was a stretch of the Danube River. The river was wide and deep enough that it was even possible to build seagoing vessels in a shipyard and sail them downstream into the inland sea. As for professionals, they could only advertise in newspapers. Frederick and Hayreddin left in a carriage. Bryant and the others breathed a sigh of relief after receiving the notice, extinguished the fire, packed up and left work. This was the third major event to welcome a major client inspection, the previous ones being the Grand Duke of Mainz and the Grand Duke of Bane. Who in the Wesson district still forges iron with their hands these days? They have long used hammers made of various magical muscles, and they only need to control the forging process. Hayridin quickly returned with local specialties and samples. As soon as the dock was vacant, a new fleet of cotton arrived. Before returning to the construction site, Frederick hosted a banquet at the castle and invited several important figures, including Imhotep. After the banquet, Frederick invited Imhotep to his study for tea. He asked, "How have you all felt here these past 2 days?" Imhotep immediately replied, "The people here are very welcoming. Knowing we were exiled here from thousands of miles away, they didn't discriminate against us and were very willing to help us." Frederick nodded slightly and said, "To be honest, in the Wesson district, 2/3 of the 100,000 residents arrived only 2 years before you. Those new residents were refugees affected by the flood and had nothing. It was the original residents who, with the spirit of helping whenever possible, helped them survive here, so you don't have to worry. From now on, we're all one family. No one will discriminate against you." Imhotep breathed a sigh of relief and said, "That puts my mind at ease. Many of my people and I are doctors. We would like to practice medicine here. I wonder if that's possible." Frederick nodded immediately and said, "No problem. I agree in principle. You can go to the Minister of Health, Frank, and he will arrange the specific matters. Also, we're planning to build a new medical school in Nuremberg. If you're interested, you can talk to Frank." "By the way, what are your specialties?" Imhotep replied, "We specialize in surgery and dentistry, and we have research on fevers, but they are of no use here." Frederick was curious why the fever wasn't useful, and after asking, he realized that the fever didn't refer to a fever in the human body, but rather to common illnesses in hot regions. The temperature in the Kingdom of Kush is always above 20 degrees Celsius, the humidity is high, and there are many biting insects, which often cause illness. But here in Wesson, it's different. Although summer is hot, it's relatively dry, and Imhotep's lips are even a little chapped. Frederick was helpless and could only tell them to drink more water. After a brief chat about housing, Frederick suddenly grew serious and asked, "Is Miss Susan the daughter of Madame Sophie?" Imhotep replied directly, "Yes, Her Highness Sophie is my daughter, and Princess Susan is my granddaughter." Frederick leaned back in his chair and calmly asked, "Why?" Imhotep made no effort to conceal his feelings. He spoke frankly. The Ghazi Empire now occupies the Anatolian Peninsula across the Sea of Constantinople and the Fertile Crescent to the south. It is a powerful nation. The Ghazi Empire is currently divided into two factions. One is marching north across the sea to conquer the Ghazi Peninsula and Constantinople, while the other is pursuing the southern coast of the Inland Sea to conquer our Kingdom of Kush and the Great Forest countries to the west. The latter faction currently holds the upper hand. The Kingdom of Kush is currently ruled by the Ayupu family. His Majesty Yuan is still young, and Her Highness Sophie was not the queen of the previous king, but only a concubine. They don't have many ministers supporting them, and many are wavering, so the Ghazi Empire supported the late Queen's Merrick family in an attempt to seize power and weaken the Kush kingdom, although Her Highness Sophie temporarily quelled the first civil unrest. The disparity in power between her and the Ghazi Empire is too great. Their defeat is only a matter of time. Frederick understood that Lady Sophie's actions were intended to preserve her family line and prevent a final purge. He could offer Lady Sophie some assistance, but facing a vast empire, it was unclear how much impact it would have. Furthermore, his own resources were limited, and his primary goal at this stage was to consolidate his territory. He didn't want to resort to peddling aid. "I understand," Frederick concluded. "You should live well here." Imhotep nodded silently. Although he was worried about his daughter, the disparity in power between the two sides was too great, and some issues would have to be faced sooner or later. After seeing Imhotep off, Frederick considered the matter and decided to send Foreign Minister Christian to visit the Kush kingdom and then explore which countries on the southern coast of the Inland Sea could serve as backup forces if necessary. Chapter 165 Arrival in Mainz. Time passed slowly, from the height of August to the chill of October, without any serious incidents throughout the canton of Wesson. The early autumn wheat had sprouted, the newly built vegetable greenhouses were being covered with film, and merchants from the city flocked to the village to order vegetables for the winter. Even the neighboring Duchy of Franconia and the Regents' Confederation, now considered foreign nations, sent diplomats to inquire about the possibility of selling fresh vegetables during the winter. The day before Frederick was to travel to the Duchy of Mainz to attend the Archduke of Mainz's 80th birthday and a hunting event, the royal family of the Osmogoric Empire even sent a special envoy requesting permission to purchase vegetables during the winter, transported directly to Wien by horse-drawn sleigh across the frozen Danube. Frederick agreed on the spot and granted them special permission to purchase them from his estate, but to provide their own transportation. Early the next morning, Frederick, bearing gifts and a large contingent, sailed for Mainz. Hunting was a quasi-military operation for the nobility. The process of finding, surrounding, and killing the prey was no different from a battle. Hunting was also a vital source of income for the nobility. Meat, furs, and other valuable commodities were prized, and capturing a magical beast was a bonanza. This hunt was meant to showcase his prowess, so Frederick brought 3 cavalry companies, half a company of mages, 2 companies of drudgers, 2 companies of pea shooters, and a detachment of black cats. Together with servants and a logistics convoy that had departed earlier, the team totaled 2,000 men. In addition to personnel, Frederick also mobilized the factories within his domain to work overtime, producing a large quantity of impressive logistics equipment. The fleet departed from Weissenberg, passing through Lohr, before arriving in Mainz, near the confluence of the Main and Rhine rivers. Philip, the Grand Duke of Mainz's diplomat, had arrived early to preside over the reception. Frederick was arriving today, and since he had become a duke, pomp and ceremony were essential. However, unlike his previous reception for the Grand Duke of Bavaria, Maria was present today. The ship docked, soldiers cleared 1,000 yards, lowered a gangplank, and rolled out a red carpet. Frederick, dressed in a white military uniform, disembarked with a smile, followed by Dawn. Philip bowed formally and offered a welcome. Maria then gave him a standard skirt-lifting salute, finishing with a subtle grimace. Frederick exchanged a few polite words before boarding the carriage with him for the city, followed by the servants and cavalry escort led by Alfred. In the carriage, Maria asked Frederick, "Why isn't Susan here?" Frederick shook his head helplessly and replied, "It's too cold here in autumn. Susan caught a cold a few days ago and is recovering." He couldn't leave Madame Sophie's daughter alone, so he let Susan stay at the estate. Before the autumn planting, the Grand Duke of Mainz sent Philip to Frederick to buy fortified wheat seed. Maria, who also lived at the estate, also visited Frederick, and that's how they met. Frederick had been back at the industrial park construction site for a while, and Maria and Susan had been spending more time there than he had. When Maria heard Susan had a cold, she immediately said, "She needs onions." Locals here consider onions a panacea for common ailments. They're eaten for colds, diarrhea, and even fevers. Adults cook them in wine, while children cook them in milk, and they're somewhat effective. The taste of them reassured Frederick about exercising and staying healthy. He smiled and replied, "I've already given her onions and milk, but she didn't want them, so she ended up pinching her nose and forcing it down." Maria glared at him and said, "You can't bully her." Frederick simply smiled. The carriage entered the city and arrived at a mansion about 500 meters from the palace where the Grand Duke of Mainz resided. It was once the residence of a wealthy merchant, who had voluntarily donated it to the Duke of Wesson. Getting an appointment with the Duke of Wesson would make it much easier to purchase local specialties there. A dozen wealthy merchants even fought over this spot. Maria wanted to stay and play with Dawn, but Philip immediately took her away and told her to go to her mother, who had something important to say. The landlord, Blanche, was a fur trader who traveled between the Rhine Confederation and the dark lands of the north, even reaching regions further east by ship in the summer. He immediately presented a generous gift, a fiery red bear skin. The bear was estimated to be 4 meters tall when standing. Frederick had never heard of this kind of bear before, so he inquired about it out of curiosity. Elsewhere, Maria returned to her mother. Sophia called her daughter to her side and asked softly, "Have you seen Frederick?" Maria immediately nodded and replied, "Yes, he's here, but Susan is not here. I wanted to bring her to meet her mother." Sophia showed a kind smile on her face. She touched her daughter's long black hair and asked, "Are you happy when you are with Frederick?" Maria answered immediately, "Yes, he can make a lot of toys. He is also very smart and can tell a lot of stories." The smile on Sophia's face became even wider. There were some things that she should tell her daughter, but she was only 8 years old. She didn't know if she could understand the meaning of the next words. "Maria," Sophia asked earnestly, "if you were to stay with Frederick forever, would you be willing?" Maria's mind was swirling with questions. She asked, puzzled, Do you mean I should visit Frederick often? Sophia shook her head slightly and said, you should live with him until your hair turns gray, just like I did with your father. Maria's mouth dropped open in surprise, and she asked her mother, Mother, do you want me to marry Frederick? And have children? She wasn't living in a vacuum. The people around her gradually understood the implications of the discussion. Sophia said, Yes, would you? Maria blushed and fell into her mother's arms, silent for a long time. Sophia simply stroked her daughter's back gently. It seemed she understood the meaning, so no further explanation was needed. Mother, Maria looked up, her cheeks flushed like a ripe apple. I don't want to leave you just yet, little fool. Sophia patted her daughter's head. I'm not asking you to marry him right now. I don't want you to marry him now. I want you to stay by my side for at least 8 or 10 years. 10 or 8 years seemed like a long time to Maria now. She threw herself into her mother's arms again and said in a soft voice, I'll do as you say. Sophia's smile grew even brighter. In a marriage between nobles, love was only a byproduct. She was lucky to have found a good husband. Now, there was a man who looked so suitable, and her daughter didn't dislike him. She couldn't let him get away. Things could change before they were finally finalized. This hunt brought together nobles from far and wide, and who knew what might happen. Sophia coaxed her daughter into staying at home. After getting dressed, she prepared to go to her own battlefield. In the afternoon, at a tea party for noble ladies, Sophia chatted with several acquaintances whose husbands were of high status about Count Wesson. Chapter 166 Busy Socializing. The Archduke of Mainz's 80th birthday was celebrated with great fanfare. Prominent nobles from across the Rhine Confederation attended, including Crown Prince Rudolf, who represented the royal family. The neighboring Kingdom of Gaul and the Helvetic Confederation also sent envoys. The social circles of the nobility were defined by rank, region, blood ties, mentorship, and shared interests, but age was irrelevant. Frederick initially thought he'd have time to spend with Maria, but their social activities overlapped little. Upon arriving in Mainz, he received invitations by the pound. There were formal banquets and balls, as well as teas and salons primarily for the ladies. However, all of them stated that the Duke of Wesson could come alone, as everyone knew he had no female relatives. So, with great anticipation, he attended a tea party hosted by the Archduke of Mainz's daughter-in-law. For these noble ladies, tea parties were a place for relaxed conversation. Sometimes, the hostess or her invited guests formed the core, with attendees gathering around them or chatting privately in groups of 3 or 2. Salons were somewhat different. They often had a theme, often art-related, and often invited professionals to attend, much like a wealthy woman inviting her favorite celebrity home and gathering her fellow enthusiasts to see them. Frederick had never seen a high-end tea party before, so he went, capitalizing on his youth and acting cute, and spent a fulfilling afternoon, physically enriching. That evening, Baron Wiesen curiously asked Duke Wiesen, "Are the meatballs not to your liking?" Baron Wiesen's grandfather was Frederick's great-grandfather's younger brother. It was he who had driven the old man from his monopoly, forcing him to flee to the late king's side. Blood-wise, Baron Wiesen's family was Frederick's closest relatives. Now that Duke Wiesen had prospered, relatives naturally flocked to visit. Today, the restaurant featured not only traditional northern cuisine but also several families related to the Wiesen clan. Baron Wiesen prepared meatballs, a common dish back home. The balls were a mixture of mincemeat, onions, eggs, fish, and other ingredients. After cooking, they were drizzled with butter and topped with shredded sweet radish. They tasted quite good. However, Frederick had been acting cute during afternoon tea, and the maternal ladies had fed him relentlessly. His stomach was stuffed, and he was now eating slowly. He smiled and said, "The food is delicious, so savor it slowly." Frederick didn't want to dwell on past grudges, such historical accounts couldn't be settled. He decided to explore expanding his business and began asking about the local customs. Baron Wiesen was relieved to see that Wiesen didn't dislike him. His priority now was to appease his nephew. "Our territory is not far south of Hammer City," Baron Wiesen explained. "The land there is quite good, flat, with plenty of water. We grow wheat and grapes." Frederick thought for a moment. Small nobles these days were like that, primarily agriculture, with a few handicrafts at best. Baron Wiesen continued, "Things are tough these days. In August, the Osmagian Empire and the Piast Kingdom fought a small war in Bohemia, But the Osmagian Empire suffered. Now the Osmagian Empire is asking the nobles across the Elbe to send troops across the Oder River next year to attack the Piast kingdom to the west, to help relieve the pressure from the south. Those nobles have been exploited by the Osmagian Empire in previous years. How could they afford to send troops? They just crossed the river and robbed us first. We had no choice but to go to the king, but to our surprise, no one in the capital paid any attention. In the end, we had no choice but to try our luck here. He began to complain, and the others at the table echoed him. However, they didn't seem to intend to ask Frederick for help. They simply wanted to pass on a message to the Grand Duke of Mainz, for a private conversation. Frederick nodded in agreement without saying anything, but he had his own thoughts. When the banquet ended, he had to go to the third event of the day. The carriage left the city and arrived at a manor not far away. As soon as he entered the gate, he could hear the sound of music coming from afar. Balls are places where nobles chase after beautiful women. Frederick yearns for this, but for now, he can only yearn for it. The host of the ball tonight is Rainer, the heir to the Grand Duke of Bane. Theodore, the heir to the Grand Duke of Mainz, is also in attendance. With the addition of the Duke of Wesson, this is a high-end event. The dance floor is full of flowers, and the ladies and girls are dressed up in gorgeous clothes. It is a beautiful sight. But this has nothing to do with Frederick. After a few polite words with him, the host went to dance and then disappeared with his beautiful partner. As for Theodore, he had long disappeared. Now sitting next to Frederick is a burly man. This man is Sforza, the head of the Helvetic Federation delegation. This time he has something to do with him. Sforza said to Frederick, "Your Excellency has many Helvetic prisoners in your domain. I wonder what you will do with them." Frederick took a leisurely sip from a glass of juice, figuring that this was indeed the problem. He spoke casually, as if discussing a trivial matter. "Don't worry. I have no plans to kill them, nor do I intend to detain them long term. I've arranged for appropriate medical treatment for those who are injured. They are prisoners of war. They need to pay a ransom for their freedom." "That's fine, isn't it?" Sforza nodded. "That's reasonable. I'd like to know how much they demand, and our country will pay it." Frederick didn't answer immediately, but instead asked a servant to bring him some biscuits. He then took the opportunity to think. Those captives were all strong mountain mercenaries. Ransoming them in small numbers would have been fine, but packing them all at once looked like an expansion of the army. The Helvetic Confederation and the Duchy of Mainz were at odds, and these men would be useless wherever they returned. So, Frederick, munching on a biscuit, replied, "I've heard the Helvetic Confederation is mountainous, with little arable land and mineral resources, and it's not a wealthy country. Your king should spend your money where it's needed most. Don't worry, they just have to work for me for 3 years and stay out of trouble, and then they can go home. Of course, those injured I'll treat will have to work an extra 2 years, Sforza, a little anxious, said. "That won't work. The captives' families rely on the money they send back to support them. If they don't return home for 3 years, they'll starve to death." Frederick feigned surprise and contemplation. If he hadn't asked, he would have felt ripped off. While mercenaries earned well, they also spent lavishly. Add to that the cost of purchasing and maintaining weapons, and they were lucky to send home a single gold coin each year. In the canton of Wesson, the average laborer earned 2 florins a year. These mercenaries were strong, hard-working, and well-disciplined, making them easy to manage. 3 florins a year was no problem. "Very well," Frederick said. "I'll pay them 1 florin a year each for 6 years. I'll send this money to their families through the church." Sforza's mouth twitched slightly, wondering if he truly didn't know or if he was doing it on purpose. If he couldn't bring them back, the king would surely beat himself to a pulp. Frederick looked smug, as if he had done something truly remarkable. Before Sforza could say anything, several young ladies, about 16 or 17, approached, giggling. One of them, seemingly having lost a bet, was pushed forward by her companions to invite Frederick to dance. Frederick, thinking to himself, "How could a child like me dance?" he accepted. Chapter 167 Making Money Together. The rain, which had fallen most of the night, ceased before dawn, washing the sky a brilliant blue. The last migratory birds of the southward migration occasionally flew overhead in the north wind. A pale golden-winged unicorn would overtake them, taking the lead, creating a shockwave that forced the birds to form lines on either side. Dawn seemed to enjoy the feeling of flying, and Frederick sensed its joy. The girl in the back was less relaxed. Though her sturdy seatbelt was securely fastened, She nervously clung to Frederick's neck. Despite her nervousness, she tried to keep her eyes open, curiously observing the white cranes not far away. 5 florins were not to be wasted. On the now blighted mountainside, many people in the hunting camp gazed up at the pale golden shadows in the sky, some with envy, some with curiosity, and some with anticipation. 5 minutes later, dawn set, and someone immediately rushed to unbuckle the seatbelts in the back seat and help the still weak-legged passenger down. A young man about Frederick's age, already dressed in a thick leather coat, helmet, and goggles, handed Maria 5 gold coins and ran happily towards Dawn. A minute later, Dawn took off, soaring into the sky amidst the cries of the passengers. Frederick didn't care whether the passengers cried or not, since he'd taken the money, he had to fly for the full hour. Initially, many people cried as they took off, but the young men and women in line showed no fear. Some boasted smugly, seemingly oblivious to the fact that the previous boaster had outdone them. 5 florins would be a large sum for ordinary people, but for these young men and women, it was nothing. Nearing noon, business ended for the day, and Frederick took Dawn to the Wesson family camp for a meal. Maria carried the cash box back to her tent in the adjacent camp, the 3-headed dog following behind. Dawn had a hearty meal that day, a large bucket of barley porridge with eggs, sweet radishes, and pumpkins, followed by a large bucket of honey water. After it had eaten and drunk its fill, it went to sleep on the thick hay. When Frederick arrived at Maria's tent, the girl had already divided the money. Each passenger had to pay 5 gold florins, and since Maria had brought all these people, she received 2 of them. After counting them, she placed the coins in a safe in the tent. Over the past few days, she had accumulated over 100 florins. This was the first money she had ever earned, and she smiled brightly as she counted the money. The 3-headed dog then lay down on the coins and fell asleep. Frederick asked her with a smile, "What are you going to do with all this money?" Maria's face suddenly flushed, and she wrinkled her nose and said, "I won't tell you." Frederick smiled and said, "I suggest you put the money in the bank. It's safe and earns some interest. You can deposit it in my bank." "Well, the bank is having a promotion right now where you can get eggs for every deposit. If you put all your money in, you can get over 2,000 eggs," Maria exclaimed in surprise. "That many eggs, one a day? How long will it take to eat them all?" "The chicks will hatch before they finish eating them all." With that, the girl's face flushed again. Frederick was a little puzzled by her frequent blushes these past few days. She certainly wasn't in high spirits. After asking twice without an answer, he stopped asking. "Besides eggs, there are other things," Frederick said with a smile. "You can also ask for olive oil." The Wesson Bank was now actively trying to attract deposits, offering decent interest rates and various gifts depending on the amount of the deposit. Many citizens began to deposit money there. Maria asked him, bewildered, "Where does your bank get all the money to buy eggs?" Frederick replied, "I can lend it to others and collect interest." "Oh?" Maria asked, half understanding. "If someone borrows a lot of money from you, buys a lot of weapons from you, and then recruits a lot of people to defeat you, then they don't have to pay it back." Frederick blinked. This economic theory sounded familiar. Someone called Maria from outside the tent. It was Sarah, the youngest daughter of the Grand Duke of Mainz's 3rd son. She had lost a lottery at the ball that night and was the first to be asked to dance with Frederick. Maria left the tent and soon popped her head back in to ask Frederick, "We're having a horse race this afternoon. Are you coming?" Hunting began the day after tomorrow, and the young people had been enjoying themselves these days, mainly to create opportunities for the Grand Duke of Bavaria's grandsons and the Grand Duke of Mainz's granddaughters to interact and to exchange ideas among various political figures. Frederick naturally wouldn't go. Having Dawn compete was too much of a bully, and those girls were too fond of playing pranks on him. Like that night at the dance, they'd grabbed him after just 2 songs and teased him. They'd still thought he was an innocent boy who knew nothing. But Frederick asked Maria, "Are you competing this afternoon?" Maria replied glumly, "My horse isn't very fast." She was short, and like most children, she rode a pony, whose short legs made it impossible for her to run as fast as a normal horse. Frederick's lips curled slightly, and he stood up and said to her, "Come on, let's go to my place. I have something for you." On the way, Sarah stood between Frederick and Maria, holding Frederick's arm with one hand. With a wicked grin, she said to him, "If you don't give Maria a good gift, I'll take her home and you'll never see her again." Maria immediately tugged at Sarah's sleeve and said, "Sister Sarah, please don't be like this. I'm happy with anything Frederick gives me." Sarah reached out her other hand and pinched Maria's cheek, pretending to be angry. "You're already favoring him before you even get married." Both children knew something, but they hadn't spoken about it in the other's presence. This caused both of them to blush. Maria tried to run, but Sarah was faster and grabbed her arm. "Don't run," Sarah said. "Frederick, I'm telling you, no matter what happens, you must pay Maria back, understand?" She was older than the two of them and knew more than Maria. She understood the nature of marriages between nobles. Her own parents' marriage was the product of a family alliance, and after a couple had enough children, they went their separate ways. Frederick, preoccupied with how to explain this to Maria later, nodded repeatedly to get by. Maria replied in a low voice, "Frederick won't. We've been making money together these past few days, and I've already earned over 100 gold coins." Sarah suddenly felt a pang of pain in her stomach. Chapter 168, Sales Promotion. The hunting camp was located several dozen kilometers southwest of Mainz. When Frederick and his guests arrived, the accompanying army, with the exception of the servants, headed directly to the camp to set up camp. When the Grand Duke of Mainz and his guests arrived, the Duke of Wessen's camp instantly became the center of attention. Sarah, holding Frederick and Maria on either side, arrived at the Wessen family camp. They spotted her grandfather and the Grand Duke of Bavaria with a large group examining the camp's perimeter wall, and hurried over to greet them. Frederick's lip curled slightly. Business was on their doorstep. The perimeter of whose camp wasn't a wooden fence, but barbed wire. The facade was made of chain-link wire, produced using a simple machine. A rotating steel bar was wrapped around a sleeve with spiral grooves. As the wire was wrapped around the bar, the grooves in the sleeve constrained it into a flat, wavy shape. The wires spun as they emerged from the machine. Someone manipulated a clutch to control the length of the wavy wires and the final cut, allowing them to continuously thread through the previous wires as they spun, intersecting horizontally and forming a single wire mesh. Around the outside and top of the chain-link fence were coils of razor wire. Frederick felt a bit depressed, having long yearned for the old-fashioned barbed wire before the war brought him to this newer type. Razor wire isn't made of wire, but rather long, thin sheets of iron. Machines first extrude them into long strips with trapezoidal spikes on either side, then emboss a groove in the middle to reinforce the structure. To prevent rust, the wires were hot-dip galvanized. The Archduke of Mainz and his group hid there, studying the razor wire, their faces solemn. The Archduke of Bane drew a dagger and slashed at the wire mesh, but without much force. The coils of wire, deforming and elastic, absorbed some of the energy, failing to sever. He then increased his force. The wire broke, but due to the material, it only cracked slightly and did not fall to the ground. Maria, curious, reached out to touch it, but Frederick quickly grabbed her hand and said, "Be careful, it's sharp." The Archduke of Bavaria examined the wire carefully and said to those around him, "If there were more of these steel thorns, it would be difficult for both the men and horses to pass through. Mobility is crucial on the battlefield, whether for cavalry or infantry. Barbed wire is not indestructible, but unlike obstacles like wooden stakes, which can be circumvented, the time required to destroy it is sufficient for the enemy to react." At that moment, Frederick approached them, grinning. "Everyone's interested in this? Well, it's nothing special. Just a little gadget to keep livestock from escaping on pastures and farms. I'm pretty poor, so I can only use this as a makeshift fence." The Grand Duke of Bane and the Grand Duke of Mainz simultaneously rolled their eyes at him. Cargo ships traveling to and from Wessen state passed through their territory, and the sheer number of ships spoke volumes about how brisk this guy's business was. After Frederick's suggestion, everyone realized that these steel thorns were indeed useful in pastures, solving the problem of cattle and sheep escaping the fence. Someone immediately asked for the price, and Frederick quoted 5 times the price of the raw material. A 100-meter piece of razor wire weighed about 7 kilograms, which wasn't too expensive compared to the problem of straying cattle and sheep being lost. And it could be used in strategic locations. Just the sight of it was enough to dissuade some from scaling the fence. At this point, the Grand Duke of Mainz asked him, "Can I see your barracks?" Frederick immediately replied, "Of course, if you don't mind, you can have lunch here." It would have been fine if he hadn't said anything, but once he did, the Grand Duke of Mainz scowled and said, "What's wrong with you? Singing so early in the morning before dinner? Can't we get any sleep?" A proper aristocratic life, drinking and dancing late into the night, rising only around noon. The Grand Duke of Mainz's camp was nearby, and he had been awakened by the singing for the past 2 days. He had barely finished speaking when lunch began in the barracks, and the singing emanated from there. "All right," the Grand Duke of Mainz said reluctantly, "we'll sing at lunch and before dinner too." Frederick simply smiled and said nothing, inviting everyone into the barracks for a tour. "I've been wanting to ask," the Grand Duke of Bavaria said, pointing to a massive structure in the camp. "What exactly is that?" Frederick replied. "Let's go over and take a look." A group of elderly men approached, their faces grimacing. A nearby tent had a sign for a restroom, while the tent opposite was a bathroom. However, the Grand Duke of Bavaria and some veterans of the war effort were unfazed. They inspected the restroom, the bathroom, and even the wash basin next to the massive structure. Instead of asking Frederick, the Grand Duke of Bavaria turned to a soldier standing guard nearby. "What is this massive structure for?" Metzger, recognizing the noble status of the elderly man, looked at Frederick instead. After Frederick nodded, Metzger replied, "Your Excellency, this is our army's water tower. These are the wash basins around it." His explanation immediately dawned on many. Many cities now have fountains. The principle behind them is to install a high-level water tank connected to the fountain, allowing the fountain to automatically dispense water. The water tower stood over 2 meters tall, with an iron frame at the bottom, bolted together, and a thick, waterproof fabric tank at top, capable of holding approximately 3 tons of water. Beneath the tank stood a well as thick as a man's leg, surrounded by mounds of earth to prevent the flow of water from the ground. Nearby, a reciprocating pump powered by the familiar magic reciprocating engine pumped water through pipes into the tank. However, the water first passed through an iron box next to the pump, the purpose of which was unknown. Under Metzger's guidance, the masters turned on the faucet, and clear water immediately flowed out. So clean, the Grand Duke of Mainz knew his domain well. The water from the well was not turbid, but it had a distinct earthy smell. Metzger pointed to the iron box next to the water pump and said, "The water we use is purified and sterilized by that water purifier, so it's odorless and won't upset your stomach." The eyes of those in the know instantly grew sharp. The most pressing concern during a war is water contamination. There's no story of a king being killed because of a horseshoe nail, but there's one example of an empire being destroyed because of an epidemic caused by contaminated water before the battle. Someone had already begun suggesting that this filter be used not only in the field but also in the barracks. It should be purchased. The filter itself was simple. The first layer was a fine mesh woven from fine copper wire, using the Y-shaped filter principle. The second layer was cotton, filtering out larger impurities. The third layer was activated carbon, and a necromancy array was also installed to sterilize the water. Frederick's mouth curled slightly. The market for this water purifier wouldn't be huge at the moment. At most, it would be a small price to pay for the filter material, but even a little bit of meat is still meat. "Huh?" Sforza, the envoy from the Helvetic Federation, immediately grabbed everyone's attention. "What are you wearing there?" he asked in a somewhat loud voice, pointing to Metzger's left breast. His question captivated everyone, who looked at Metzger's chest and noticed a colorful object. Note, I asked this question to Teobeo Customer Service. Chapter 169 The Real Big Business. During his post-war review of the Six-Day War, Frederick offered several suggestions, one of which concerned military honor. Medals and decorations were among them. At Frederick's nod, Metzger proudly replied, "This is my decoration. It records my service and achievements." The Grand Duke of Mainz, intrigued, asked, "Well, tell us about it then." Metzger, not bowing his head, pointed to the long, dark blue, 3-white star insignia in the center. "This is the third-class soldier's insignia, the highest rank among soldiers. The one on the right, with a white vertical bar on a black background, is my service insignia. Each year represents a bar. The one on the left is a skill insignia. Green is for rifle marksmen, crimson is for cherry gunners. I'm preparing to take the medic exam. If I pass, I'll get a new color." He finished introducing the first row and pointed to the leftmost insignia in the second row. It featured a golden double-headed eagle on a red background, flanked by golden swords. A beaming smile of immense pride spread across his face, and he declared triumphantly, "This is the badge of the Order of the Golden Eagle, the highest individual honor in the army." "Oh?" the Archduke of Mainz asked in surprise. "So, you performed a significant service." Frederick smiled and replied, "Indeed, Metzger not only performed brilliantly in battle, but he was the one who killed Count Ries." As soon as he finished speaking, exclamations erupted from the surroundings. Dozens of nobles, knights and above, died in the 6 Days' War. Of the 5 highest-ranking counts, Frederick killed one amidst his vast army. One was reduced to briquettes while leading a cavalry charge, one was killed by Francis the Younger, and one was killed in an explosion while fleeing with the crown prince. Everyone knew that Count Rhys died during the retreat, but there were differing accounts of the circumstances. Many disputed the Wesson cantons' version of him being killed by a soldier. Now that the man himself was before their eyes, someone asked him to recount what happened. "There's no rush," said the Grand Duke of Mainz. "We can save that story for tonight's drinks. Now, let's get on with the medals," the Grand Duke of Bavaria remarked. Yes, a story like that wouldn't be complete without wine. Everyone else echoed the sentiment. A little embarrassed, Metzger began to introduce the next medal, a red medal with 4 crossed swords. "This is our company's collective first-class merit badge. The one with 4 swords next to it is the combat experience badge, one for each battle participated in. And the one at the bottom is the 6 days defense medal." After he finished, Frederick noticed Sfort saw a sneer, but it faded quickly. Frederick thought he was probably upset because he hadn't released the prisoners, and that this might cause him trouble. But it didn't matter. This was half his home turf, it would be hard to lose. Besides, the territory was short of labor, so there was no reason to let those people go. The Grand Duke of Mainz and his men were focused on Metzger. They discussed the medal for a moment and thought it was a good idea, perfect for showing off, and more convenient than wearing a medal that could be used as armor. "But let's go see where you live," the Grand Duke of Mainz said to Metzger. Metzger looked at Frederick with some embarrassment, and only agreed after the commander nodded. Many noticed this, wondering how sophisticated the Duke of Wesson's military management skills were. Their men didn't dare to respond without a word. The Grand Duke of Mainz said to Metzger, "Let's go, lead the way," but Metzger didn't move, instead asking everyone to wait. Little Franz, the commander of this operation, had been on standby since the guests arrived. Seeing this, he immediately sent his staff to the mess hall to find someone to relieve him. A moment later, Babo, the captain of Metzger's squad, arrived with a soldier. Amidst the crowd's astonishment, Metzger stood at attention. After Babo gave the command, "Change of sentry," he and the relieved soldier exchanged salutes. "Command," Metzger said. The relieved soldier immediately replied, "Omelette with chives." Metzger quickly replied, "Vinegar braised beef." Frederick frowned, his face etched. Who had come up with that command? The relieved soldier then said, "Sentry, please step down." Metzger replied, "We have a visitor at the water tower post today. Everything else is normal. Please step up." They exchanged positions and saluted again. Metzger saluted Babo and reported on the situation at his post. After Babo allowed him to move freely, he addressed the Grand Duke of Mainz. "This way, please." The Grand Duke of Mainz and his companions observed the entire change of sentry. They could see that the soldiers' movements and conversation were smooth and orderly, not rehearsed. Someone in the crowd whispered to their companion, "It'd be hard to fake a change of guard." Many around nodded in agreement. This small detail revealed the extraordinary discipline of Duke Wesson's army. Metzger led the group to his tent. Upon entering, several of the leaders were puzzled. A traditional tent has 1 to 3 pillars in the center, depending on its size, to support the top. Ropes are then used to pull the top open like an umbrella. Drapes are then hung around the perimeter, and the bottom secured. This tent, however, lacks pillars and is supported entirely by steel pipes. It appears spacious and makes it easier to enter and exit in emergencies. A thick waterproof sheet is laid on the floor, connected to a steel frame with hemming. As long as water outside doesn't reach the threshold, it won't flood inside. Inside, there are 12 beds supported by steel pipes. Metzger demonstrated how they fold and unfold. On the bed sat an inflatable pillow and a neatly folded sleeping bag. Beneath the foot of the bed sat a yellow plastic basin and a pair of slippers. In the basin sat a water cup, toothbrush, and towel. A backpack sat next to the headboard, looking perfectly tidy. In the deepest part of the tent sat a samovar, a type commonly used by the Eastern ants. These large kettles had an iron pipe running through the lid, allowing for ice in the summer and charcoal in the winter. Metzger walked over to the samovar and began explaining, "We have a daily ration of tea and sugar, and everyone pools their resources to make tea." The Grand Duke of Mainz looked directly at Frederick and noticed he was still holding Maria's hand, apparently from the time they'd been researching steel thorns online. He glared at him fiercely. But business was more important. The Archduke asked, "How much will this cost?" Frederick smiled and replied, Compared to the soldier's health, it's nothing. We've done research. In traditional camps, if they're stationed for more than a month, 1 in 10 soldiers will fall ill, reducing their combat effectiveness. After 3 months, the number rises to more than 4, and one of them becomes seriously ill and completely incapacitated. We've improved the camps to address the causes of illness. Previously, soldiers stationed in the new camps for 3 consecutive months, from July to September, only 5 out of 100 fell ill, and all recovered within 3 days. Those with experience in marching nodded repeatedly. During long-term combat, the longer the duration, the greater the non-combat casualties. Frederick heard the soldiers leaving the mess hall after lunch and said, "I think everyone's hungry. Let's go have lunch first." The Archduke of Mainz nodded and followed him out of the tent. Frederick did not lead them to the mess hall, but instead to a vast and luxurious tent. The tent was constructed from I-beams, channel steel, and steel pipes. It was large enough to accommodate a standard basketball court, with room for spectators standing around it. Frederick was no stranger to this type of large tent. In a previous life, a relative in the village used a similar tent for weddings and funerals, and he had helped out several times. Besides the surrounding tarpaulin, the tent also had a wooden floor covered with soft wool carpets. The walls were hung with exquisite silk tapestries, and overhead, several crystal chandeliers adorned the grounds. Long tables were set up on 3 sides of the tent. After everyone took their seats, Afu and the maids arrived with kettles, basins, and towels for everyone to wash their hands. Then, lunch was served. Soon, the table was covered with Wesson bread rolls, Wesson chicken rolls, fried chicken nuggets, French fries, red ketchup, and a black, bubbly drink. Maria, separated from Frederick by the Grand Duke of Mainz, smiled delightedly at the sight of the black drink and took a long sip from her cup. At the other long table, Philip agreed, smiling, and took a drink. Everyone watched the father and daughter, and with them leading the way, they took a sip. The Grand Duke of Mainz tried it and asked Frederick in surprise, "What is this?" Frederick smiled and replied, "Happy water." He then said to Maria, "Don't drink too much." Maria immediately replied, glumly, "Got it." There was no way to completely recreate happy water. Psyche initially mixed a small amount of sugar extracted from sweet radish juice, caramel, lemon juice, lime juice, phosphoric acid formed by burning phosphorus pentoxide in hot water, and essential oils distilled from orange blossoms. She added this dark drink to soda water, creating a drink that always felt a little off, and it was shelved for a long time. It wasn't until Psyche discovered a medicinal herb that Imhotep and his companions had brought with them from the south to Weissenberg that happy water finally tasted like the real thing. Frederick, naturally, wouldn't forget Maria when he had such a good thing. He immediately sent a few barrels to her family for trial, and the feedback was positive. The Grand Duke of Mainz, imitating Frederick, dipped the fries into the red ketchup and began to eat them. He found them quite tasty and asked, "What are these?" Maria quickly replied, "I know, they're made from Elizabeth potatoes." Frederick continued, "This year's Elizabeth potato harvest is excellent, enough for next year's market launch. I'm giving some to try." The Grand Duke of Mainz, not particularly concerned about food, asked between bites, "I have a question for you. Can you help me train my army?" The Grand Duke of Bavaria, sitting on Frederick's other side, also offered, "If you can, help me train too." They were both knowledgeable and understood that an army wasn't just about new weapons, training was crucial. Many who have reviewed the 6 Days' War have noted that the key to the Wesson state's victory over an enemy many times its size was its army's ability to conduct continuous, high-intensity, large-scale operations, gradually eliminating weaker foes before they could react and ultimately encircling the strongest. Such an army cannot be built with money alone. There is a whole set of military management methods behind it, such as the medals, the changing of guard procedures, the camps, etc. Frederick's mouth curled up slightly. The real big business had finally arrived. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 170, Future Father-in-Law Asks Questions. Among the numerous arms dealers, those like Yuri Olive who simply sold weapons were merely small-time vendors. The real money came from selling complete military equipment, providing training and even contracting for an entire nation's defense. Almost no one, including the Grand Dukes of Mainz and Bavaria, had any concept of a formalized military or a systematic equipment system. Feudal armies lacked the fertile ground for such an army, leaving Frederick with a blank slate to build upon. However, it was still possible for these two duchies to establish an elite unit directly under the Grand Duke's command. Frederick ate a piece of fried chicken while saying, "Such an army is very expensive. Back then, I had no choice but to survive, and I resorted to every possible means to raise funds, which allowed me to support 2 regiments. Although I'm a little better off now, I don't plan to expand any further in the near future. I simply can't afford more. My plan is to establish city defense forces in various regions to handle defense, and these armies will serve as my primary force." The 2 Grand Dukes beside him nodded in agreement, their understanding of the situation being clear. Frederick picked up a chicken roll and continued eating, saying, "My suggestion is that you 2 train a regiment based on the archers you've already refitted, see how it works, and then consider expanding it." The Archduke of Mainz asked, "How much does a regiment cost?" Frederick quoted the same price Ahmet had quoted, shocking the Archduke so much that he dropped his fries. The Archduke of Bane was also surprised and asked, "So expensive?" Frederick explained, "This includes the entire supply package, including barracks, vehicles, mules, and horses." The most important factor in ending the war so quickly this time was that the entire army was on wheels, relying on the tactical advantage of speed to offset strategic disadvantages. The 2 leaders nodded, and then everyone began discussing the fried chicken. Military matters couldn't be decided in a few words, they had to consult their staff and formulate plans. This seemed feasible. Now that the 3 parties were working together, the pressure on the home front was greatly reduced, freeing up resources for external operations. Frederick wasn't in a hurry, so he explained that chickens were becoming increasingly popular in Wesson, and the price of chicken and eggs had dropped significantly. Seeing that they had finished their business, Sarah said to the Grand Duke of Mainz, "Grandfather, Frederick just said he had something special for Maria." The Grand Duke of Bane asked Frederick with interest, "Oh, what's he going to give Maria this time?" The Grand Duke of Mainz said expressionlessly to the man next to him, "HMPH, if it's not something good, I'll beat you up." Maria, who was feeding her 3-headed dog fried chicken, immediately looked up and said, "Godfather, Frederick just said he was broke, so it doesn't matter if the gift isn't expensive." At the other side of the long table, Baron Harold, the Minister of Revenue of the Duchy of Mainz, smiled and said to Philip, who was standing beside him, "How do you raise your daughter? Is a gift worth less than 100 florins even a gift?" Philip replied calmly, "Maria has earned over 100 florins these past few days with Frederick, and so, one more heartbroken person appeared in the world." At this time, Rainer, who was sitting next to the Grand Duke of Bane, said, "Wesson can't be poor. You can look at the tapestries around and the carpets on the ground. The patterns of these carpets and tapestries are mainly geometric floral and animal patterns. The patterns are arranged symmetrically with a center. They are exquisite and fine, and the materials are exquisite. They are all treasures of the royal family of the Daci Empire. The craftsmen there have to learn how to weave carpets at the age of 7. When they graduate, the children are 7 or 8 years old. When they become truly skilled workers, the grandchildren are also 7 or 8 years old." There is a story in the Ghazi Empire. When a merchant was crossing a bridge, a tapestry from the Daci Empire fell into the water. The fairy in the water asked whether it was a gold tapestry or a silver tapestry that fell. Maria immediately said, "I know." The merchant must have been very honest and said that what he dropped was an ordinary tapestry. Rainer smiled, shook his head and said, "The merchant immediately beat the fairy into a pig's head, and while beating her, he said that the gold tapestry and the silver tapestry combined were not as expensive as the silk tapestry that fell into the water." Many people knew that Rainer had traveled to the Ghazi Empire and the more distant Great Stone Empire to the east in his early years, so there would be no mistake about this. The Grand Duke of Bane said in surprise, "It's so precious." Frederick smiled and said to Rainer, "If you like it, pick one and take it back." When Hayradin came to Wesson, he robbed a fleet at sea and used these spoils to exchange with Frederick for a batch of silver scale breastplates. The others thought Frederick had bought these and were amazed at them. Frederick turned back and whispered a few words to Alfred, then brought a gift for Maria. He had originally planned to give it to Maria at the formal banquet, but since the young masters and young ladies were going to the horse race this afternoon, it was a good time to give it now. Not long after, a silver-white unicorn appeared in the middle of the tent. The Grand Duke of Mainz's hand trembled, and the cup of happy water in his hand cracked. If there was one thing he wasn't happy about, it was that Wessenland had a herd of unicorns, while he only had a unicorn-blooded warhorse. He was immediately outmatched in terms of mounts. He even planned to wait for the Wesson unicorns to give birth and then shamelessly ask for one. He could even trade them for the equally precious three-headed dog. Frederick ignored his feelings and turned to Maria, saying, "Maria, this is for you." Maria's eyes widened. She knew Frederick had many unicorns, but she had never expected one she had never seen before, and it was for her. Philip's mouth twitched. This gift was truly precious. Even though his family had a copper mine, they probably couldn't afford it even if they went without food for 7 or 8 years. Before he could decide what to do, Frederick had already dragged Maria over to the unicorns. Frederick had originally wanted Psyche to make Maria a harnessing necklace, but she said she didn't need it. As expected, Maria reached out and gently touched the unicorn's silvery cheek. The unicorn nuzzled her hand with delight, then her face. Maria smiled at Frederick and said, "The child looks happy. I'm happy too." "Thank you," Frederick smiled back and said, "as long as you're happy, for him." Maria's happiness was all that mattered, what others thought was none of his business. However, there was one person present who deserved attention, Maria's father, after all. Frederick approached Philip when Baron Harold said to him, "Well, I think he's about to take advantage of this opportunity to propose to your daughter." He spoke in a quiet voice, but everyone was watching Maria and the unicorn, and no one spoke loudly, so the whole crowd heard. Frederick was startled, thinking this matter would take days to develop. He hadn't expected someone to bring it up now. Once the arrow was shot, there was no turning back. He couldn't refuse now, or others would suspect he was trying to curry favor with Maria to gain control of Sophia or Philip. Frederick watched Philip's expression change several times, finally culminating in a look of resignation. He gritted his teeth, mustered his courage, and approached him, saying, "Your Excellency, I have a request. I beg your permission to betroth your daughter, Maria von Ertl, to me." A momentary silence fell, save for Maria's sudden cry of awe, and her hands covering her flushed face. Philip turned and glared fiercely at Harold, sighing inwardly. Then, he said seriously, "I will grant your consent to you if you do one thing." Frederick waited quietly for the next words. This was a unique custom in this area, for the prospective father-in-law to give his son-in-law a hard time. If he agreed to the marriage, he would make a simple request. If he refused, he would make a difficult one. But once the son-in-law fulfilled this request, he could not go back on his word. Then, the Archduke of Mainz approached, looking displeased, and pulled Philip aside, muttering to himself for a long time. Frederick's mouth twitched, and it seemed that this time, there would be no peace. The two quickly reached a consensus and approached Frederick, beaming. "My request is simple," Philip said earnestly. "You're quite skilled at inventing machines, aren't you? If you can invent a machine that allows people to fly, without magic or beasts, I'll agree to let Maria marry you when she comes of age." The Grand Duke of Bane then intervened, saying, "I say, that's too much." The Grand Duke of Mainz glared at him and said, "Don't meddle in our family affairs." Frederick was stunned. This was a no-brainer. "No problem," Frederick agreed immediately. "I'll arrange it right away." Philip and the Grand Duke of Mainz's hearts skipped a beat. They exchanged glances. They just tried to scare him into asking for an easier task, but now it seemed like it wasn't going to be a problem for him. Frederick went over, hugged Maria, said, "Wait until I get back," and then left the tent, riding the dawn towards Wessenland. Chapter 171 Make a hot air balloon. Recently, new tea houses have been popping up in Wessenland. These spacious, bright rooms are furnished with comfortable chairs and bookshelves. Groups of guests gather here, bringing their own books to share and discuss. On this Sunday afternoon, a large private room in one of the tea houses was crowded with guests. The radio blared with music from the Wesson radio station. It was music time, and the performers were members of the former Wesson family band. Frederick hadn't taken Vanessa to the Grand Duchy of Mainz this time. She needed to sort through documents from various departments for her boss's return. She sat shoulder to shoulder with Schmidt, studying a book from the Kingdom of Anglia titled Natural and Political Observations on the Death Bill. On a nearby sofa, Katie and Curler, with serious expressions, analyzed the color schemes in a handwritten storybook from the Kingdom of Gaul. Base and his wife, who was 5 or 6 months pregnant, sat on the other side, listening to Duval promote the latest in insulated milk bottles. Duval's new wife, Wagner, was nearby, sharing her collection of unmarried women of marriageable age with her fellow student, Liebherr. Professor Elmite had ordered the nerdy student to find a partner and get him out more often. Liebherr was on pins and needles, eager to return to the lab and continue tinkering with his excavator. Suddenly, a voice from the radio shattered the silence in the private room, an urgent announcement. Schmidt, Besf, if you hear this, come to the castle immediately. Whether the president can get a wife depends on you. Elmite's voice was all too familiar. The urgent announcement repeated 3 times before everyone, looking at each other in bewilderment, finally snapped back to their senses. Hurry, hurry, Katie was the first to jump up. Get back to the castle and see what's going on. Although her name wasn't mentioned, she was the most excited about Frederick. Liebherr was the next to jump up. He said, I'll call a taxi for you, and quickly ran out of the private room. Bass said to his wife, it seems this isn't a simple matter. You should go home first. His wife had just agreed when Wagner said to her senior brother, don't worry, go ahead. I'll take her home. Schmidt looked at Vanessa, who, seeing her boss was busy, naturally wanted to go back and see what was going on. Seeing everyone else had left, Keller and Duval followed to watch the fun. When they arrived at the castle's living room, they saw Frederick glaring at Elmite. Minister of Administration Frick and several other important officials had also arrived. They were happily discussing the future Duchess's wedding dress with the tailor Roman and Psyche. Katie immediately went over and rubbed Frederick's face, which had already been rubbed by Psyche, saying, oh, our Frederick has finally grown up. Frederick chuckled and said, sister, you'll have to work harder too. Don't let me get ahead of you. Oh, Katie pinched his face angrily. Seeing everyone gathered, Frederick had a maid bring a blackboard. He then stood in front and announced, I've received a project to build a machine that can send people flying, without the use of magic or monsters. Schmidt and the others were startled, then excited. Many people had researched such a machine, but none had succeeded. Furthermore, given the existence of flying monsters, investment in this area had been limited, and progress had been slow. Now, Frederick had gathered everyone to explain that he had a plan. Frederick had previously traveled in a hot air balloon, so he drew a picture on the blackboard, noting its dimensions. 26 meters high, with a maximum diameter of 12 meters, and a hanging basket underneath. Katie curiously asked, wait a minute, the model will be ready soon. A moment later, a maid brought in a freshly glued Kongming lantern. Frederick lit a linen cloth soaked in alcohol in a cup below in the living room, and soon the Kongming lantern took flight. The Kongming lantern flew for a short while before he cast an ice spell, extinguishing it and then slowly descending. He had a psychological trauma with Kongming lanterns. In a previous life, a Kongming lantern had caught fire on the safety net at the construction site next door. The damage was severe, and the perpetrators were never apprehended. So, he had never used them for fun. That's the principle, said Frederick. The density of hot air is low, so the balloon generates buoyancy, which lifts up the basket below and the things inside. The balloon is made of linen, and the outer layer is coated with glue to prevent air leakage. BASF immediately nodded and replied, that's no problem. I can ask the factory to transfer the goods from the warehouse immediately. Frick also said, you can buy linen in the name of the executive yuan, and it will be gathered quickly. Then Roman said, I think this cloth must be strong and light enough. I'll let my students check it and not let bad cloth get mixed in. Professor Ahmet, can you use a lathe to make a model that is 10 times smaller right away? I'll use paper to determine the size of each piece of cloth, and then make a large sample for other tailors in the city to cut, and you can also ask embroiderers to help sew it. Frick immediately agreed and said that he would ask the workshop that makes waterproof cloth to help. Frederick nodded in agreement, then said, there's another question, what should we use to fuel the fire below the hot air balloon? It needs to be continuous and intense, and no magic can be used. He had fallen into a cognitive blind spot, using the 21st century sightseeing hot air balloon as a model, unaware that the first hot air balloon back home burned straw and flew 2 kilometers. So Psyche smiled and said to him, how about trying wood? Frederick shook his head, subconsciously feeling that this method was unreliable. He initially considered acetylene, commonly found on construction sites, but he had forgotten how to get calcium carbide. Liebherr, who had fled here to escape a supposed girlfriend, asked, can we use an alcohol burner? Setting up a burner matrix is enough to heat the air, huh? Frederick was stunned. There's an alcohol burner? He knew what an alcohol burner was, of course, but he had never used one in his previous life, except for heating charcoal in copper oxide in chemistry class. Of course, Liebherr said. Isn't that what they use to dehair pigs' trotters? Frederick blinked, thinking he'd been away from the grassroots for too long. Thinking again, he realized that the calorific value of anhydrous alcohol was higher than that of wood, about the same as coal, so it should be fine for the job. Okay, let's use this, Frederick said to Liebherr with a smile. When you succeed, come with me to Mainz. Maybe you'll find a girlfriend, in all their time here. This was the first time Frederick had seen Liebherr outside the blacksmith's shop. The man had been working on an excavator, but while the excavation system was complete, the movement system was having problems. So, Almite had been trying to get him out of the blacksmith's shop, to do something else, to change his mind. Maybe he'd find some inspiration. But as soon as Frederick finished speaking, Liebherr's face paled. Everyone ignored him, assuming he was away on business. Frederick began to assign tasks to the group. Frederick looked at Schmidt and then at Liebherr. He had originally wanted Schmidt to be in charge of this job, but now he changed his mind and said, Liebherr, you will be in charge of this project, and Schmidt will help you. Liebherr was stunned. He did not expect that the principal would assign this task to him, and immediately refused. No, let Schmidt do it. I have no experience, so I can just run errands. Frederick shook his head and said, it is precisely because you have no experience in project management that I let you take charge of this project. Otherwise, how can you manage a factory like Schmidt, BASF, and Duval in the future? Liebherr hesitated for a moment, and finally said, okay, I'll try. After the task arrangement was completed, everyone started to get busy with their own things. Chapter 172 Flying. Late at night, people still clung to sleep, gathering around the city center square to watch the tailors and embroiderers stitching a large object. Someone, thinking this was related to the afternoon broadcast about the master's marriage, asked a tailor they knew, are you sewing the master and his wife's wedding dress? The tailor shook his head and replied, I don't know, we just work. He then continued sewing a red and a yellow piece of fabric together. Soon after, Liebherr came over and carefully checked that the fabric had been sewn with 2 correct stitches and that the gaps between the stitches were not too wide. Cutting the hot air balloon envelope, which Frederick had thought would require a series of calculations, turned out to be surprisingly simple for the tailor, who used the same method for making hats. The carpenter's shop cut out a model, applied paper, and then divided the paper into grids. The paper was peeled off and cut according to the grids, finally enlarging it proportionally to the fabric size. Besides the tailors, many others were mobilized. A cable merchant at the harbor simply had his warehouse emptied out for a nominal fee, so he could boast later that he'd helped his master find a wife. The large hanging basket beneath the balloon was a complex undertaking. They also sourced a large, sturdy wicker basket from the harbor, but the first one reeked of salted fish, so they later replaced it. The waterproofing workshop even brought all its tools directly to the central square, sewing large pieces and immediately starting work. The blacksmith shop was the busiest. Schmidt had a sudden flash of inspiration and modified an alcohol blowtorch on the spot. Alcohol blowtorches use a portion of the flame's heat to vaporize alcohol, which then mixes with air and burns violently. He modified the lamp head, creating a pipe that loops around the flame, allowing the alcohol inside to be vaporized and ejected. The pipe was made of copper tubing from a pressure gauge factory. The fuel barrel storing the alcohol was simply a modified pressure cooker. A copper pipe was welded to the safety valve on the lid, and a sealing valve from a steam engine pressure gauge was added to allow for pumping. At the pressure valve, the inner end connected to a tube extending into the pot near the bottom, while the outer end connected to the main sealing valve and copper tubing leading to the blowtorch array. Before ignition, simply pump air into the pot with a gas pump. Once the pressure is sufficient, close the sealing valve on the pressure tube and open the main sealing valve. Alcohol is then pumped to the blowtorch array under pressure, and the power can be adjusted. Experiments have shown that this burner has quite a powerful flame. A parasol valve, like an open umbrella, presses against the top of the balloon from within under the influence of rising hot air. It is controlled by ropes, pulleys, and a control cord. To vent, pull the control cord, and the edge of the parasol valve separates from the balloon, allowing the hot air to escape. To close the balloon, simply release the cord, and the hot air will lift the parasol valve and seal it against the balloon, preventing gas from escaping. Frederick also ordered a thermometer and a barometer with a specially designed rotating dial, which converts the scale to altitude for reference. By the time the sun crested the sky, the hot air balloon was finally complete. Frederick immediately ordered a test flight and had a chicken, duck, and sheep brought in as the first passengers. He had one end of a mooring rope fixed to each of the upper and lower vents. 2 more mooring ropes were then positioned at these points, forming a square. Giant trebuchets were also assembled around the balloon. Their counterweight baskets were loaded with weights, and a horizontal pole over 10 meters long was erected high. Ropes lifted and expanded the balloon's upper section. Frederick made sure the mooring ropes were securely tied before crawling under the balloon and letting Liebherr start the fire. 16 blue flames, over a meter long, shot out from the alcohol torch array. Hot air quickly filled the balloon, causing it to swell. After confirming the torch array was functioning properly, Liebherr and Frederick slipped out, leaving the chicken, duck, and sheep in the basket. Shortly after the ropes at the trebuchets were released, the balloon soared into the air. The hot air balloon rose higher and higher, finally being caught by the tether about 500 meters above the ground. After about 10 minutes, the fuel ran out, the flame died, and the balloon slowly descended back to the ground. Someone quickly ran over, untied the top rope from the burner rack, and then, along with several others, pulled it. The other end of the rope was connected to the top of the balloon, controlling the direction of the balloon's landing. More people followed, checking the balloon and its components for damage. The chickens, ducks, and sheep were all pulled out of the hanging baskets, all alive and kicking, enough to make for tonight's extra meal. Frederick waited quietly on the side until Liebherr came over, then he asked anxiously, "How is it? Is there anything broken?" "No," Liebherr replied, "everything is normal." At this time Schmidt also came over and said excitedly, "I think we can load more fuel so that we can fly longer." Frederick shook his head and said, "No need to be so troublesome. If we want to make it practical in the future, we will use magic circles to replace the burner. Now pack up everything and ship it to the Duchy of Mainz overnight." The next day, under the midday sun, the fiery red-hot air balloon attracted the attention of the entire hunting camp, and the yellow double-headed eagle emblem on it was particularly eye-catching. In the hanging basket, 500 meters above the ground, the Grand Duke of Mainz forced himself to remain calm and said, "Well, this little gadget is interesting, just enough." The Grand Duke of Bane sneered beside him, "If you can, stop shaking your feet when you talk." The Grand Duke of Mainz replied, "If you can, stop shaking." Philip asked Frederick, "How long will it take us to get down?" They had a general understanding of the hot air balloon's principles, but not a complete grasp of them. They also felt that this overnight contraption was unreliable and worried they would plummet after the blue flames above them died. The 3 of them clung to the edge of the hanging basket. If they weren't wearing gloves, they would have cut their hands on the vines. Frederick didn't answer. Less than 2 minutes into the flight, he continued to throw an apple into the air. A flash of golden light appeared, and dawn swooped down from the sky, snatched up the apple mid-air, chewed it twice, and swallowed it, then circled around, waiting for the next apple to fly out. At that moment, Frederick's eyes shifted. "Let me tell you a joke," he said. "There's a bear, a pig, and a crow in a hot air balloon. The crow kicks the bear and says, 'Get back over here, you big idiot. Give me some space.' The pig follows suit and kicks the bear, forcing it to get back a little. Then the bear gets angry and throws the crow on the pig out of the balloon. The crow laughs and says to the pig, 'You're so stupid. I can fly.'" The joke ended, but the 3 passengers didn't laugh. Instead, they all stared nervously at the flames overhead. Frederick smiled silently, waiting for someone to agree. He quietly reached for the valve on the alcohol tank and gave it a slight twist. A moment later, he heard 3 people behind him exclaiming, "Ah! The fire's going out." The passengers' cries didn't rekindle the flames, instead, they seemed to be slowly fading. The passengers' cries only intensified. The Grand Duke of Bane wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and was the first to realize what Frederick was up to. He wondered why he couldn't resist his curiosity and waded into this muddy water. If he didn't continue, he would probably lose a few years of his life. He immediately shouted to Philip and the Grand Duke of Mainz, "Hurry up and agree to Wessen's marriage." 2 minutes later, the hot air balloon slowly landed on the ground, and the 3 passengers jumped out before the basket touched the ground. Frederick left the basket and walked to Maria. With a smile on his face, he picked up his blushing fiancée and spun her around a few times. Maria lowered her head and punched him, then asked, how much should they charge for letting their guests go up to the sky this time? Chapter 173 The hunt begins. Maria's money-making plans had to be put on hold, as the hunt officially began. The sound of horns drifted on the north wind, hounds dashed from camp, falcons circled over the forest, and the hunters, filled with anticipation, galloped towards the hunting grounds. Frederick, riding Dawn, led his men to the chosen area, repeating his instructions. Remember, we can't push too hard today. We must harvest less than the Grand Duke of Bavaria. The principle is, we can't be the first among the guests. Little Franz asked, puzzled, why should we do this? The Grand Duke of Mainz said that the first-place guest will receive a precious gift. Frederick replied sternly, we absolutely cannot accept that gift. Little Franz was puzzled, but since his master had spoken, he obeyed. Hunting competitions rely on piling up the prey to see who can make the highest and largest pile. A magical beast among the prey is a bonus. Frederick had already chosen his primary hunting area, a small lake, over 100 meters in diameter, deep in the forest. Traces along the lake and on-site reconnaissance suggested that numerous animals frequented the lake daily to drink. Their goal was to form a perimeter around the lake, driving the surrounding animals to its edge and then surrounding and eliminating them. Frederick, completely clueless about hunting, had handed today's operation over to Little Franz. The team quickly dispersed in platoons, and then something went wrong. Although the forest was nearly leafless, visibility remained poor, and the command post on the hilltop quickly lost sight of the team. Frederick didn't take off with Dawn to search for the troops, but instead watched Little Franz, scratching his head anxiously. In the past, troops moved in large numbers, making much more noise and visible from afar. Small operations, usually involving only one or two teams, would often involve the commander in one, ensuring they wouldn't lose half the group. Now, with a large-scale, small unit operation, a few dozen men entering the forest wouldn't cause much of a stir, like throwing salt into water. Whether marching, fighting, or driving, losing control of the situation is the beginning of disaster. This sense of loss of control brought immense psychological pressure to young Franz. Frederick said nothing, leaving the problem to him to find a way to resolve. He led Leibherr, Schmidt, Besf, and a dozen others who had come to launch the hot air balloon, to a more distant mountain to search for the Hell Wolf. On the way, Frederick asked Leibherr, why didn't you tell me earlier that your hometown was in the Duchy of Mainz? Besf replied to his fellow apprentice and fellow villager, yes, if your father hadn't come and pulled your ear, I wouldn't have known. I haven't seen you back in these 2 years. Their original reason for fleeing from Constantinople was primarily because of the large number of locals. Amit's hometown was in the Duchy of Bavaria, less than 50 kilometers from the Grand Duke's castle. Besf's family was a renowned dye merchant in the Duchy of Mainz, less than 100 kilometers from the city. Leibherr's home was farther away, bordering the Duchy of Bavaria. However, his family was a renowned architectural family in the Duchy of Mainz, and his father was currently an official in charge of construction projects at the palace. Leibherr said, somewhat sheepishly, I ran away to Constantia on my own. My family was furious. I heard there's a wanted poster for me hanging in the city. Schmidt asked curiously, many people run away to Constantia to study. How did you provoke your family so? Leibherr raised his head, peering through the iron-like branches at the blue sky, and said calmly, my family wanted me to marry into a material supplier family. I ran away at noon on the day of my engagement. He sighed deeply. Besf pondered for a moment, then said, so it was you. No wonder. If I were you, I'd run away too. Before anyone could start gossiping, the faint aroma of barbecue wafted through the air, the kind without seasoning. Attention, Besf gestured. Hellwolves nearby. Everyone perked up, forming a circle, weapons pointed, and paying particular attention to the downwind area. The silence was eerie, with occasional sounds echoing through the wind, a clear sign that something was surrounding them. Soon, the wind from upwind warmed slightly, and the encirclement formed. Hellwolves' bodies are incredibly hot, burning to the touch wherever they step. Their jaws can even burn their prey, and strong adults can even breathe fire. Their meat is known to warm the spleen and stomach, nourish the kidneys and yang, strengthen the body, and replenish qi and blood, making it a perfect winter food. This time, they were hunting hellwolves primarily to prepare some for Besf's wife. With current medical technology, winter is still a dangerous time for pregnant women, and eating hellwolf meat can boost immunity and prevent colds. Like other wolves, hellwolves excel at hunting in groups and ambush attacks, surrounding their prey and then swarming them. However, this time, these prey-like creatures showed no respect for their martial principles. "Throw poison gas bombs," Frederick said calmly. Several men downwind immediately pulled out fist-sized smoke bombs and launched their charges. Soon, thick white smoke billowed downwind toward the trees. Within 2 minutes, bursts of wailing rose from the smoke, then fell silent. The 5 fluorine gas bombs seemed effective. The hell wolves over there must have gone to sleep. On the other side of the encirclement, the hell wolves, upon hearing their comrades' wails, not only did they not flee, but they attacked Frederick and his men. Though these men usually tinkered with mechanics, they were all skilled magicians, armed with double-barreled hunting shotguns. In no time, the dozen or so hell wolves that charged were decimated. 7 were stunned by the poison, their limbs and snouts quickly bound, and they were sent to be carried back with a wooden stick. With this reserve of magical beasts, they wouldn't be left behind in their hunt this evening. Elsewhere, young Franz contacted the entire force through the sound of a bugle call, and upon seeing everyone present, they began to move. Everyone shouted as they dashed through the woods, startling pheasants, deer, wild boars, rabbits, red foxes, lynx, and other animals into flight. The encirclement gradually narrowed, and the beasts scurried around the lake, trying to find a way out, when gunfire rang out. After noon, the soldiers began collecting the prey and stacking them by type. Before dusk, Frederick had his men divided into 2 groups. The larger prey would be taken to the Grand Duke of Mainz's camp first, and if there were too many people, more would be added. The rest would be brought back to their own camp for a snack in the evening. He also instructed them to spread out the prey and keep it low. In the end, the Grand Duke of Mainz had the most prey, followed by the Grand Duke of Bavaria. Frederick's own prey, under his control, seemed to be third, but some disagreed. Chapter 174 The Best Gift. "We should have more prey than you." Frederick hadn't expected Sforza, the envoy from the Helvetic Federation, to step out and tread on him. In this situation, face is the key to success. Not retaliating would create a reputation as a coward. If things continue to escalate, previous achievements would be questioned, and people would fabricate all sorts of evidence to prove you're just trying to gain fame, plummeting your reputation. Frederick glanced at the Helvetic prey. Their stacking technique was impressive, and the pile was a meter higher than his own, though the base was smaller, so the visual difference wasn't as significant as the height. They'd also hunted some monsters, a few mature rock bears, that matched the hell wolves. So, the Grand Dukes of Mainz and Bane remained silent, trusting Frederick's wisdom. Frederick visually assessed the size of the 2 piles, then shook his head and asked Sforza, "Do you really think yours is larger than mine?" Sforza replied matter-of-factly, "Of course. My prey is much taller than yours." The seating arrangement was supposed to be a major event today, with many people watching. He hadn't expected such a scene. Frederick pretended to sigh and asked again, "Are you absolutely sure yours is larger than mine?" "Of course," Sforza said confidently. "Of course, if you were standing on top of it and it were even slightly taller than mine, I would definitely admit defeat." He then laughed heartily, seemingly quite pleased with himself. Frederick said helplessly, "If you were a student in Wesson, I'd make you clean toilets for a month." Without waiting for Sforza to reply, he addressed the Grand Duke of Mainz, "Please have someone measure the base circumference and height of the 2 piles." The Grand Duke of Mainz, sensing a solution, immediately arranged for measurements. Sforza's heart skipped a beat. He'd assumed Frederick would have his prey weighed, so he'd filled the stomachs of many of them with wet sand. He'd never imagined it was a volume measurement. He glanced at the 2 piles, and his own was noticeably taller, which reassured him. The measurements for both piles were quickly completed. Frederick's pile had a base circumference of 15.7 meters and a height of 2 meters, while Sforza's pile had a base circumference of 12.6 meters and a height of 3 meters. Frederick didn't give Sforza a chance to speak again. He extended his hand, focusing light elements, and drew a circle and a cone in the air, saying, "Given the circumference of the circle, we can calculate the base radii of the 2 piles to be 2.5 meters and 2 meters, respectively. So, using the cone volume formula, we can deduce that my prey has a volume of 13 cubic meters, and yours has a volume of 12.6 cubic meters. Clearly, mine has more." Sforza was at a loss for words. His math skills, like those of many nobles, were pathetic, and he couldn't find the words to refute them. Without giving him a chance to speak, the Grand Duke of Mainz chuckled, It seems Wesson has more prey. Then he turned to Sforza. It's not surprising to be mistaken. Just keep your eyes open and watch more next time. Come here, bring the gift. The master's final word left Sforza speechless. A large iron cage covered with a colorful cloth was quickly wheeled over on a cart. Frederick, smiling, slowly retreated. The Grand Duke of Mainz went over, uncovered the cloth, and said to the Grand Duke of Bane, "My dear friend, you took first place today. This is for you." The guests immediately buzzed with chatter. A three-headed dog. This gift was truly valuable. Frederick noticed that the people of Mainz were awe-stifling laughter, and the Grand Duke of Bane's face paled. He quickened his pace. "I accept your kindness." The Grand Duke of Bane, evidently knowledgeable, glared at the Grand Duke of Mainz. But this gift had to be accepted, as everyone was about to become relatives, and refusing the gift would affect the overall situation. The Grand Duke of Mainz was a little nervous at first, but when he heard that he accepted it, a heartfelt smile appeared on his face. Unexpectedly, the Grand Duke of Bane looked at Frederick, who had not been able to run far, and said kindly and affectionately like his own grandfather, "Frederick, come here quickly, you and Maria are engaged and I don't have a gift for you. Maria happens to have a three-headed dog, so I'll give this one to you, and it's a perfect pair." Frederick's face twitched, and he meowed. If these three huskies were really that easy to raise, the Grand Duke of Mainz would not give them away. The reason given by the Grand Duke of Bane seemed very reasonable and could not be refuted. Frederick's eyes turned and he looked at Sforza. Unexpectedly, upon catching his gaze, Sforza approached the three huskies, saying, "Oh, these are incredible treasures. Oh, my ankle's twisted. I need to get some medicine." However, it was his right ankle that had been sprained, and it was his left that had limped when he ran. Frederick glanced at the people around him. Baron Wesson looked envious, but he was a relative after all, so he couldn't trick him. Just then, a high-ranking, obscure figure caught Frederick's eye. The Archduke of Mainz was celebrating his 80th birthday, and the royal family naturally wanted to celebrate, so Crown Prince Rudolf represented the family. However, he hadn't yet recovered from the trauma of 6 months ago, and with Frederick present, he kept a low profile. Frederick smiled like an ant. He went over and pulled Rudolph's sleeve, saying, "Hey, Rudolph, it's been so long since I've given you a gift. We've grown apart. Today is a good day. This magical beast looks quite valuable, so I'm giving it to you as a gift. You must accept it." Many people at the scene wanted to laugh when the young Frederick addressed himself as uncle to the adult Rudolph, but now was not the time, so they held back. There was nothing wrong with Frederick addressing himself as uncle, as the Treaty of Wesson had stipulated. Therefore, calling himself uncle to the Crown Prince was also acceptable, and it seemed as if the two families had put aside their past animosity. Rudolph received a glare from Frederick, then instinctively said, "Thank you very much, uncle, for the gift." The two archdukes present kept their smiles on their faces, but sighed inwardly. It was unclear whether it would be a blessing or a curse for such a man to inherit the throne. As the sky darkened, the Archduke of Mainz waved his hand, signaling the start of the banquet. Hunters and cooks from various families worked together to select the best prey to slaughter and roast on the side, and then serve it to the masters, mistresses, young masters and young ladies. Taking advantage of this opportunity, everyone presented gifts to the Grand Duke of Mainz. The first person to present a gift was Rudolph. On behalf of the royal family, he presented a scepter with a diamond as big as a walnut, and he himself presented a purple cloak. The Grand Duke of Mainz accepted the gift with a smile. He knew very well the political significance of the scepter, and he said a lot of words of loyalty to the royal family. For a time, the atmosphere was extremely harmonious. The Grand Duke of Bavaria was next. His gift was a sword used by a heroic ancestor. Swords were not given as gifts in normal friendly relations, but this was to show the world that the relationship between the two families had reached a new level. Then came Frederick. He presented a gold chest the size of a microwave oven, studded with gemstones, and said with a smile, "What's inside this chest is even more precious than the chest itself." "Oh." The Grand Duke of Mainz placed the heavy chest before him and replied with a smile, "If it's not precious, I'll beat you." The chest's high price was immediately apparent, and everyone was filled with curiosity and anticipation, eager to discover what lay within. The Grand Duke of Mainz opened the chest and froze for a moment, his expression becoming more solemn than ever. He asked a servant to bring water, washed and dried his hands, and then carefully removed the gift. The people around him had already been filled with anticipation, but they were surprised to find a large, thick book within the chest. Many wondered if it was the legendary magic book. The Grand Duke of Mainz gently turned the pages and perused them, leaving the entire audience stunned. After a long while, his old friend, the burning mage Beecher, stood up and said, "If you had studied magic this seriously before, you would have become a mage by now." The Grand Duke of Mainz finally came to his senses, closed the book, and said to his old friend with deep emotion, "If you and this book fell into the water together, I would save this book first." Beecher was used to joking with him, so he naturally didn't care. Instead, he walked over from his seat and said, "Let me see what book it is. If it's not a good book, I'll beat you up." He walked up behind the Grand Duke of Mainz, glanced at the cover, patted his old friend on the shoulder, and sighed, "Indeed, I wouldn't agree if you saved me first." The Grand Duke of Mainz gently stroked the cover of the book, looked up at Frederick and said, "Thank you. This Germanic dictionary is the best gift I have ever received." Frederick smiled and said, "This is only the first volume. It contains everyday words, enough for ordinary people. There will be more words in the future, probably 15 to 20 volumes." The efficiency of the translation court improved significantly under Celsus' leadership. His status as the former director of the Royal Library of Constantinople and his extensive knowledge reduced unnecessary bickering among the scholars. Frederick instructed the translation court to compile and publish a first volume of commonly used vocabulary, with more complex, specialized terms to be published later. "Great, great," the Grand Duke of Mainz nodded repeatedly. "No need to rush. Take your time. When will this volume be available for sale?" The Germanic Dictionary, Volume 1, was roughly the size of an A4 sheet of paper, with 1,500 pages. Printed on both sides, with moth-proof ink and a sheepskin cover, and including the editor's costs, each copy cost 3 florins. Frederick stated the price, then added, "The printer has already begun printing and binding. And the first batch of 500 copies will be available next spring." The translation court plans to edit a simplified version next, at a lower price. The Grand Duke of Mainz nodded in satisfaction. A book like this wouldn't be used by the average person, and those who would need it were likely well off. The price was reasonable. Chapter 175 Academic Planning. From the second day on, hunting was free. Instead of going in families, everyone formed teams with friends and family. With no outsiders around, it was the perfect time for private conversations. Unbeknownst to everyone, countless exchanges of interests and intrigues unfolded in the leafless forest. Frederick had wanted to go hunting with Maria, but unexpectedly, the young woman had become the proprietress of a hot air balloon ride business. The 5-minute flight cost 10 florins, and the waiting list stretched for days after the hunt ended, keeping Liebherr and his team busy. Frederick didn't care, as long as Maria was happy, it was all that mattered. On the third day, an unexpected person invited him to go hunting. The hunt was fake. The two found a grassy area by a stream, had someone grill some meat, and then, relaxing on folding chairs, talked business. "You've ended an era," Beecher sighed deeply, his face darkening. His eyes were like dead fish, devoid of the pride and confidence expected of a god of magic. "I conducted an experiment," he said calmly. "I filled a sealed, insulated jar with water, with a partition inside. I activated the vortex spell inside, and later used the tornado spell." The water rubbed against the jar and the partition. In the absence of phlogiston and the element of fire, the water's temperature rose. The phlogiston theory is over. Countless people's centuries of research have come to nothing. I sent my paper to Magic Magazine and asked them to publish it this December. Let the old era end this year. Frederick's expression remained unchanged. The story began with his book The Three Properties of Force and the Energy of Motion, and a conjecture on why we stand on the Earth. He was not exposed to the cutting-edge academic world at the time, and he had no idea that the phlogiston theory was still popular. Under energy of motion, he naturally included a bunch of energy conversion experiments from textbooks, including experiments on converting mechanical energy into internal energy. These experiments were simply fun for the average person, but to scholars like Beecher who studied the phlogiston theory, they were like lightning from a dark cloud. The phlogiston theory originally derived from the elemental theory of all things. Scholars believed that everything in the world was composed of magical elements, and that combustion was essentially the release of fire. As alchemy developed, it was discovered that some chemical reactions, including those involving combination and decomposition, showed no trace of magical elements, and that objects without magical elements could also burn. In these cases, the phlogiston present in the objects replaced the fire element. Beecher and others believe that the fact that complex objects burned into simple ash suggested that phlogiston acted like nails and glue, binding simple substances together to form a complex one. During combustion, the phlogiston dissociated, causing the complex to fall apart. The weight of the ash, compared to the weight of the material before combustion, was the weight of the phlogiston. Their explanation for why objects ignite and burn is that there is an upper limit to the amount of phlogiston an object can contain. When the phlogiston exceeds a critical value, a chain reaction of phlogiston dissociation occurs. The ignition of one object by another demonstrates that a large amount of phlogiston dissociated from one object enters the adjacent object, causing the excess phlogiston in the adjacent object to exceed the critical value, leading to combustion. Sometimes, the flames of some burning objects fail to ignite others, merely heating them. Their explanation was that the temperature reflects the amount of phlogiston present. The more phlogiston there is, the higher the temperature. The temperature at which an object can hold the most phlogiston without burning is its ignition point. If the phlogiston, acting as an adhesive, becomes insufficient, it compresses the object into a solid mass. Further reductions can damage the object, such as the graying of tin at low temperatures and the brittleness of steel. Some substances bind to phlogiston in unusual ways. When accumulated to a certain level, they loosen and form vapor, rather than dissociating and burning. This explains the interaction between water, ice, and water vapor. Because of this characteristic of water and phlogiston, it can inhibit the chain reaction of phlogiston dissociation, effectively extinguishing fires. Beecher, seemingly unsatisfied, explained Frederick's theory from beginning to end. Frederick was surprised by how complete and comprehensive it seemed, explaining so many things. "I didn't expect it," Beecher said with another sigh. Frictional heat was always seen as a dark cloud in the sky of phlogiston theory, but in the end, its lightning shattered everything. He then picked up the glass and downed the happy water like a bottle of wine. Frederick refilled Beecher's glass and said, "My teacher always said that being full after 10 slices of bread doesn't mean you're full after the 10th slice and don't need to eat the previous 9. The same is true on the path to truth. We can see further by standing on the shoulders of those who came before us." He had no idea that this statement would later be included in Beecher's paper acknowledging the failure of the phlogiston theory. He continued, "There's an alchemical experiment I've only imagined but haven't yet carried out. If phlogiston really doesn't exist, then the results will be consistent with my expectations." Beecher turned around, waiting attentively for the next words. Frederick asked, "Have you heard of the experiment on the weight of the soul?" Beecher nodded. It was a famous experiment in history, difficult for ordinary people to perform, but the results were very important. Years ago, when the debate over the weight of the soul was still going on, a tyrant constructed 10 giant scales. He placed living people, along with charcoal and lime to prevent decay, into a large box, sealed it with lead, and hung it on one end, with a counterweight on the other. Among these individuals were utterly wicked criminals as well as virtuous priests. According to the theory of the time, their souls would weigh differently. However, after 2 months, the balance remained unchanged. The tyrant ordered a small hole in the box to be opened to allow the souls to escape, but the balance remained unchanged. Frederick, of course, wasn't referring to an experiment on living people, but rather to an experiment conducted by a baffled scientist back home. Prepare a glass cover and a dish. He used light elements to draw a diagram in the air. Put phosphorus inside, use a magnifying glass to focus sunlight to ignite it, and measure the change in its weight before, during, and after burning. Such experiments can be replaced with other substances, such as some easily flammable things. I have done several experiments about combustion before. Put a wooden board with a burning candle on it in a basin of water, and use a transparent glass cover to turn it upside down in the water. After a while, the candle went out before it was completely burned, and the water level in the glass cover was higher than that in the basin outside. I guess this is because some component in the air participated in the combustion and was consumed, and the charcoal also consumed air after burning inside. When the charcoal and candle burned, they also produced a gas that made the limestone turbid. Put a mouse in a sealed glass cover as well. It eventually suffocated to death, and at the same time, this gas that makes the lime water turbid would appear in the air. These white turbid substances can decompose into the same gas when heated. The decomposed substances will generate heat when they come into contact with water, and then they will produce this white substance when they come into contact with this gas. Do you have any ideas? Beecher immediately replied, limestone, the same as limestone. Frederick nodded and said, yes, I speculate that the transformation between the main components of limestone and quicklime and slaked lime is related to heating, the release of heat, and this gas. In alchemy, the phlogiston gap can be filled by temperature. Why do some reactions require heat and others release heat? This is a new research direction. Beecher listened quietly and nodded politely. He did not blindly accept the so-called new theory like an empty-headed person. Instead, he thought about how to repeat these experiments. Frederick saw that his once dull eyes gradually brightened and began to think again. I have an idea. Frederick's lips curled slightly. I'd like to have the University of Wessenland take the lead, and I'll pay for it. We'll invite renowned experts and scholars in a particular field to Wessenland every 2 to 3 years to hold a seminar. We'll have face-to-face discussions on cutting-edge research and academic debates in that field. For example, after the phlogiston theory was concluded, you all need new directions for development. Instead of scratching your heads at home, why don't you all sit down and study carefully? You might find something new. Beecher turned his head and glanced at him. If that's the case, at least 4 of the gods of magic will be in attendance. Frederick smiled broadly. That was exactly the effect he was aiming for. However, Beecher continued, just because I'm friendly with you doesn't mean others will be friendly with you. Have you ever considered what you'd do if you messed up and they wanted to beat you up? Frederick's mouth twitched. If so many top figures wanted to beat him up, even his master would probably back down. Psyche would at best help with the fight, and Maria might sell tickets. Well, Frederick paused. Let's agree first that we should fight with words instead of with fists. Beecher didn't respond, but thought about it. After drinking a glass of happy water, he said, this is indeed a bit attractive. I will write to ask everyone first. I will inform you if there is feedback. Frederick nodded, and said, actually, I have another idea. Set up a jury, regardless of country, region, or belief, to regularly select people who have made great contributions to all mankind in several major fields. Well, mainly theoretical work that reveals principles. The prize money for one award is 5 kilograms of gold. How much? Beecher pinched his ears. Tell me again how much the prize money is. Frederick answered seriously, 5 kilograms of gold, of which 1 kilogram is a medal, and 4 kilograms of gold coins. Beecher was silent. The annual salary he received from the royal family was only 250 grams of gold more than the bonus. He suddenly became serious and said, if you don't want this turned up as a farce, then you need strict standards and judges. Frederick nodded and said, yes, so I want to use various seminars as an opportunity to have a good communication with scholars about this matter. Beecher thought more about it for a long time and finally felt that it was feasible. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.